It began on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday. I was on my usual commute to work when I first noticed him, a man in a worn tweed jacket, standing by the bus stop with a calm, unreadable expression. I'd seen him once before at a local coffee shop, but today he appeared again, leaning against the cold metal of the bus shelter. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence. After all, city life was full of familiar faces in passing. Yet, as the day progressed, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was off. When I reached my office, a nondescript building I'd walked past for years, strange things began to happen. During a morning meeting, I caught a glimpse of the same man seated in the back row. He wore that same tweed jacket, though his hair, which I remembered as dark and neatly combed, now looked streaked with silver in places. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but he was still there, silent and observant, his gaze lingering a moment too long. I mentioned it to a coworker later, but she smiled politely and insisted she hadn't seen anyone unusual. It was as if I were the only one aware of him. Over the following weeks, anomalies piled up. One evening, as I was leaving work, I passed by a narrow alley that I'd walked down 1,000 times. Today, however, the scene was subtly altered. A mural on a brick wall had been repainted overnight, a mural depicting the same bus stop where I'd seen the man. The colors were vivid and disturbing, and in the middle of the mural was a small, almost imperceptible figure that resembled him. I stopped in my tracks, heart thumping, but when I looked again later, the mural was back to its original, drab state. At home, things grew even more perplexing. I began noticing small changes in my apartment that I was certain I hadn't made. My bookshelf, which I'd organized meticulously, now contained a few new titles that I didn't recall buying. My coffee mug, my favorite one with a quirky print, was on the counter when I was sure I'd left it in the cabinet. I even found a note on my fridge written in an unfamiliar, looping script. Time slips away. The handwriting was elegant, almost hypnotic, and it sent a chill down my spine. Then came the glitches in time. One morning I woke up disoriented, with a split-second feeling of déjà vu that lasted far too long. As I checked my phone, I realized that several hours had passed without any memory of how I'd spent them. I recalled stepping out for a walk after lunch, only to later find that my schedule had inexplicably jumped ahead. On another occasion, while waiting for an elevator, I experienced a bizarre pause, as if the world had frozen, then resumed as though nothing had happened. I'd look at my watch, and the minutes would appear to have skipped, leaving gaps in the narrative of my day. The stranger in the tweed jacket became a recurring presence in these glitches. I began encountering him at odd hours and in unexpected places. On the subway platform at dawn, in a dimly lit park at dusk, even in the reflection of a storefront window as I passed by. Yet each time, he seemed to subtly change. Sometimes his eyes shone with a hint of mischief. Other times, they were filled with quiet sorrow. His manner was always calm, almost as if he were an observer recording the shifting details of a broken script. I tried to confide in friends about these experiences, but when I described the altered timelines, the inexplicable changes in my surroundings, and the recurring presence of the man, they merely smiled and said I was stressed or overworked. Even my coworkers, when I mentioned the man's uncanny appearances during meetings, dismissed it as a fluke of my imagination. I began to wonder if the glitch was limited only to me, a defect in my perception, a crack in the facade of reality that only I could see. One night, as I sat in my apartment poring over the photographs I'd taken, snapshots of the everyday scenes now marred by inexplicable alterations, I noticed something chilling. In a series of images taken from my window, I saw that familiar figure standing on the opposite building's ledge. In one photo, he was looking directly at me, his face shifting imperceptibly between the expressions of calm and something unreadable. It was as if he were a marker in a timeline that was being rewritten before my eyes. Desperation gnawed at me, and I began scouring my old journals and social media for clues. I found posts about missing time and altered memories that I didn't recall writing. Conversations with close friends were laced with gaps that I now recognized as missing fragments of our shared history. The more I tried to reconstruct my days, the more I realized that not only was reality changing around me, it was changing within me. My recollections of events felt increasingly unreliable, as if a hidden force was editing my memories like lines of code. It was on a particularly unsettling afternoon that I reached my breaking point. I was on a routine walk through the city when I encountered the man again, sitting on a park bench under a withering tree. I approached him cautiously, heart pounding, and asked, "Who are you? Why do you keep appearing?" He regarded me with a slight tilt of his head and replied softly, "We're all part of the same error, an anomaly in the system. Some things cannot be controlled, only observed." Before I could ask another question, he stood and merged with the shadows, leaving me with a sense of profound isolation. Now, as I write these words, I am gripped by an inescapable certainty. The world I once knew is nothing more than an illusion, a carefully constructed narrative that has been glitching and rewriting itself. I no longer trust my memories or the steady passage of time. Every day, I wake to find small changes, a shifted object, a forgotten conversation, the recurring image of a stranger in tweed, that accumulate until I feel as though my entire existence is a series of overlapping loops. I have become part of this anomaly, a lone observer trapped in a malfunctioning reality where every moment might be a glitch in the matrix. And with each passing day, as the glitches grow more frequent and the changes more profound, I can't help but wonder if I will ever reclaim the reality I once took for granted, or if I'm now destined to wander through a fragmented world that defies all logic and reason. I moved into a modest apartment in a quiet part of town, excited for a fresh start in a place that promised normalcy. On my first day, everything was exactly as I'd imagined. A neat, sunlit living room with a cozy sofa, a small table by the window where I placed my favorite ceramic mug, and a hallway lined with familiar portraits of past residents. It was comforting, a sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world. But that very night, as I settled in, I noticed something odd. The mug was still there exactly as I'd left it, but it felt as if I were looking at it for the second time, as if I'd seen it before in the same precise spot. The next morning, as I sipped coffee in the kitchen, I swore I caught a glimpse of a note taped to the refrigerator door. I couldn't remember placing it there. Leaning in, I read the neat, looping script, "Welcome home." I frowned, puzzled, because while it was oddly warm, I knew I hadn't written or received anything like that. I chalked it up to a prank or my own sleepy mind misplacing memories, and carried on with my day. Over the following weeks, the changes became more persistent and unsettling. Every evening when I returned from work, the living room would be just a little different from what I remembered. The sofa, which I always left facing the window, sometimes appeared to be rotated slightly toward the door. A painting that had hung above the fireplace was one day replaced by a similar but subtly altered version, its colors a shade darker. I began to question whether I was simply losing my mind, or if something inexplicable was happening within these four walls. One afternoon, I came home early and paused in the hallway. The wallpaper pattern, once a consistent pale blue, now had a small, dark tear running along the edge, as if someone had deliberately ripped a tiny piece off and then taped it back together. In the dining room, the antique clock on the mantel, which always showed the correct time, now displayed a time that was exactly 5 minutes ahead of what it should be. I checked my watch. Everything was normal, but in that moment, every piece of furniture, every decoration, seemed to be participating in some silent, deliberate choreography. I started to document these occurrences, snapping photos and keeping a meticulous journal. Yet the more I recorded, the more I realized that each image, each written detail, was self-contradictory. A photograph taken on Tuesday would show the same table in one spot, and on Wednesday, the table appeared moved by exactly a foot, though I had not touched it. The notes, always written in that identical neat script, became more frequent. Everything is not as it seems, and you are where you belong. I tried showing these to a friend, but they dismissed my concerns as stress-induced hallucinations, saying I was reading too much into mundane changes. Then came the night that shattered my remaining grip on certainty. I was lying in bed when I heard a faint rustling sound coming from the living room. Forced by a mix of dread and determination, I crept out of my room. The hallway light was dim, and as I approached the living area, I saw my ceramic mug sitting exactly where it always had been on the table. But then I noticed something chilling. The mug was now engraved with a faint inscription that I had never seen before. My initials, followed by a date that was clearly from the future. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized I had no explanation for this impossible detail. The next morning, I woke to find my apartment completely rearranged. The furniture was exactly as it had been the day before, yet every item seemed to occupy a different role. A chair that once faced the window now pointed toward the door. The bookshelf held books in a different order, and even the picture frames on the wall were now tilted at odd angles. It was as though I was trapped in a closed loop, living the same day repeatedly, with subtle changes accumulating like digital glitches in an otherwise flawless simulation. Desperation gnawed at me. I began questioning whether these events were manifestations of my stress or something more sinister, a deliberate manipulation of my reality. I tried to leave the apartment, to get out into the bustling city and feel the steadiness of a world untouched by these inexplicable shifts. But no matter how far I walked, no matter how many familiar streets I passed, I kept encountering the same anomalies. A particular cafe would always have the same arrangement of chairs and tables. Yet one day, a single chair might be missing or a new painting hung on the wall that I was sure hadn't been there before. The tipping point came one night when, after returning from a late shift, I walked into my living room and found the message scrawled on the wall in what looked like the same looping handwriting. "You have become part of it." I felt a cold dread wash over me as I realized that the place I had assumed to be my safe haven was not just shifting, it was transforming into something that was beyond my control. Each time I revisited the same room, the details changed, a perpetual rearrangement, as if reality itself were a mutable script being edited on the fly. Now, as I sit here typing these words, I know that my life is entangled in a loop I cannot escape. I stare out the window at a city that appears unchanged. Yet every time I blink, I fear the familiar has altered in ways that only I can perceive. I've come to accept the possibility that my world is nothing more than an elaborate illusion, a closed system where every detail is subject to inexplicable change. I am trapped in a reality that rewrites itself in subtle yet unmistakable ways. And I can no longer tell if these anomalies are simply glitches or if I've become part of a grand, sinister experiment. The unsettling truth is, I don't know if there is any escape from this loop. Perhaps the real horror lies in the realization that nothing is as permanent as it seems, that every moment is a fleeting fragment in a world that is continuously being reassembled without my consent. And so I sit in this ever-changing space, questioning if normalcy ever truly existed or if, from the beginning, I was destined to be part of an endless shifting simulation, a glitch in the matrix that I can neither understand nor outrun. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I woke up to the familiar sound of my alarm, its steady beeping slicing through the haze of sleep. I followed my usual routine, showering, dressing, and grabbing a quick coffee before heading out the door. The day seemed entirely normal, but as I stepped outside, I felt a strange dissonance, as if a subtle shift had occurred overnight. On my walk to the bus stop, everything appeared typical. The same cracked sidewalks, the same worn buildings, and even the same chirping of early birds. Yet, as I waited for the bus, I noticed something unsettling. Across the street, I saw my neighbor Mark, who I always greeted with a wave. Today, however, he was standing completely still with his eyes fixed on a spot in the distance, his face expressionless. I rubbed my eyes, assuming I was mistaken. Mark had always been warm and animated, never a man to stare blankly as though lost in thought. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my sleepiness. At work, the oddities only multiplied. I arrived at the office and found that the layout seemed slightly off. The break room, which I knew well, now sported a different arrangement of furniture and a bizarre new painting on the wall, a swirl of colors that reminded me of a distorted reflection. I mentioned it to a coworker, Sarah, expecting a quick explanation like they redecorated over the weekend, but she frowned and said, "I don't remember that ever being here." Her uncertainty only deepened my unease. As the day progressed, I began experiencing moments of eerie repetition. I walked down the corridor and suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. I had taken that exact same turn before. Every detail, from the worn carpet pattern to the hum of the fluorescent lights, was identical. I stopped and retraced my steps, only to find the corridor exactly as it had been a few minutes earlier. My pulse quickened as I questioned whether I was caught in some inexplicable loop. That evening, back in my apartment, I sat down to relax with a book. As I flipped through the pages, I became aware of a subtle, rhythmic flicker in the lamplight. At first, I dismissed it as a power fluctuation, but then I noticed that the reflection in the window behind me seemed off, a distorted, almost pixelated version of the familiar street outside. I peered closer and saw, for just a split second, a figure standing on the corner that wasn't there before. When I blinked, it vanished without a trace. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, a trick of tired eyes, but the feeling of being observed lingered. Over the next few days, the glitches in reality grew more frequent and harder to ignore. I started documenting everything. I took photos of my apartment, the street, and even the office break room, comparing them to my memory of how they should look. Every snapshot revealed minute differences. A coffee mug moved slightly off-center on my desk, a clock that displayed a different time than I remembered setting, or a door that seemed to change its design ever so imperceptibly. I even recorded a video of myself leaving for work, only to review it later and notice that a familiar passerby, a man in a dark coat I always saw on my route, appeared in the background in several clips, even when I was sure he wasn't there before. I began to feel that time itself was betraying me. I'd wake up certain that I had just had a conversation with a friend, only to discover later that the discussion never happened. Text messages and emails would arrive from people recounting events that I had no recollection of, as if my day had been edited without my consent. My memories became fragmented, slipping through my fingers like digital data lost in transmission. The more I tried to piece together the sequence of events, the more I realized that nothing was fixed. The world around me was in constant, subtle flux. One night, I sat in my living room with the lights dimmed, trying to force myself to relax. The television played a muted news broadcast in the background, but my attention was drawn to the window. Outside, the street lamp's glow was steady when I knew it should have been flickering with the passing of a passing car. Instead, it pulsed in a steady beat that echoed the thump of my own heart. I swear I heard a soft click like a digital reset, followed by a momentary freeze in the scene outside, as if reality itself had skipped a frame. I stood there, transfixed and terrified, unable to tear my eyes away from the unchanging scene, even though every instinct screamed that something was horribly wrong. When I tried to speak to others about these experiences, they dismissed my accounts with polite smiles and concerned glances, as if I were overreacting or simply misremembering. Sarah at work insisted that the break room had been decorated the same way for years, and Mark later laughed off his blank stare as if he were joking. I began to wonder if I was the only one perceiving these glitches, if perhaps I was trapped in a personal malfunction of reality that no one else could see. Now, every day is filled with a nagging dread of uncertainty. I record my routines meticulously, yet every playback reveals small anomalies that I cannot explain. Sometimes I catch a shadow where none should exist, other times a sound, a faint, static-like hum, that seems to emanate from nowhere. I feel as though the fabric of the world is tearing, exposing a chaotic underlayer that I'm not meant to understand. I've come to the unsettling realization that reality might be nothing more than an elaborate simulation, prone to glitches and rewrites that only I am sensitive enough to notice. I still don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something far more profound is breaking down around me. The repetition of moments, the subtle shifts in my environment, and the inexplicable intrusions of strangers in the background all point to one terrifying possibility. I've become part of a system that is malfunctioning, where time and space are no longer reliable. I stand on the edge of certainty and madness, convinced that the world, as I once knew it, is slipping away. Whether this is a mere coincidence or evidence of a deeper, more sinister breakdown in reality, I cannot say. All I know is that every day, with every glitch and every unexplained moment, I feel more and more that something is fundamentally wrong, and that I might be trapped in a loop from which there is no escape. The first time I noticed something was off, it was small, so small I almost didn't register it. My apartment door had a peephole. I was sure of it. I'd looked through it countless times to check for deliveries or see who was knocking. But one morning, as I grabbed my keys to leave for work, I glanced at the door and froze. The peephole was gone. At first, I thought maybe I was misremembering. Maybe I just assumed it was there, because every other apartment door in the building had one. But when I pressed my hand against the wood, there was no sign it had ever existed. No outline, no rough patch where it might have been removed. Just smooth, unbroken surface. I shook it off. It was early, I was tired, and I had more important things to worry about. But then it started happening again. The next day, the street outside my apartment looked different. The traffic lights at the intersection had always been vertical, mounted on tall poles. But as I walked to work, I noticed they were suddenly horizontal, stretching across the street on a long metal beam. I hesitated, staring up at them. Was I losing my mind? Had they always been like this? No, I was certain they hadn't. I walked this route every day. I would have noticed. I started paying attention. That's when I saw the changes everywhere. The coffee shop where I grabbed my morning espresso had a blue logo. I knew that because I always thought it was an odd shade for a cafe sign, almost too bright, like it belonged on a tech store instead. But that morning, it was red. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it for so long that the barista inside shot me a weird look through the window. I went in and asked, trying to sound casual, "Hey, did you guys redo the sign recently?" The barista frowned. "What do you mean?" "The logo. It used to be blue, right?" She gave me a blank look. "It's always been red." I didn't argue. I just nodded, took my coffee, and left. At work, my cubicle felt wrong. My chair, the one I'd been sitting in for months, had different armrests, round instead of flat. The office plants seemed like they had been replaced overnight, even though I saw them just fine the day before. But it wasn't just things. It was people. My coworker, Jason, had a deep voice, one of those voices that carried across the entire office. Except, that afternoon when he spoke to me, his voice was higher. Not drastically, but enough that I noticed. Enough that I felt my stomach twist. I asked him if he was feeling okay, if he had a cold. He just smiled. "I've fine." Why? I couldn't explain it. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was stressed. Maybe I was mixing things up in my head. Maybe I was just wrong. But the changes kept happening. A park near my building had always had a statue of a man on a horse. I used to pass it on my runs. But one morning, the statue was of a woman standing alone, holding a book. I stared at it for so long that a passing jogger actually slowed down and asked if I was okay. I pointed at the statue. "That used to be a horse, right?" He looked at me like I was insane. "It's been like this for years, man." I felt sick. I started taking pictures, recording my surroundings. Every morning, I would snap a photo of my apartment door, my street, my desk. But whenever I looked back, everything in the pictures matched the new versions. Not what I remembered. No proof. No sign that anything had changed at all. Then one night, I was woken by a sound. A click. I sat up, heart hammering. My apartment was silent, but something felt wrong. The air was heavy, charged. I reached for my phone and checked the time. 3:12 a.m. I heard the click again. It was coming from the front door. Holding my breath, I crept out of bed and into the living room. The door was shut, locked, but the doorknob was twitching, just slightly, like someone was testing it. I backed away, my skin crawling. Then nothing. No footsteps retreating. No shadow under the door. Just silence. I barely slept. The next morning, I checked my door. My peephole was back. It was right there in the center of the door. The same size, the same slightly smudged glass. I pressed my hand against it, feeling cold metal. It was real. I checked my photos, the ones I had taken every day. Every single one now showed the peephole, as if it had never been missing. I was trapped in something I couldn't understand. I started avoiding conversations, stopped asking questions, because no one else noticed the shifts, and every time I tried to explain, I was met with polite confusion or worse, concern. And then the last change happened. One evening, I was sitting at my desk, staring at my laptop screen. My own name was written at the top of an email draft. But the longer I looked at it, the less familiar it felt. I whispered my name aloud. It sounded wrong, like I had said it for the first time, like it wasn't mine. Panic clawed at my chest. I checked my ID, my work badge, my lease. Everything still had my name, but it looked foreign, as if it belonged to someone else, as if I was borrowing a life that didn't quite fit me anymore. I looked around my apartment, my own home, and realized with absolute certainty, this wasn't mine. None of it was. And the worst part? I don't think I was supposed to notice. It started with a mailbox, a small, ordinary thing that shouldn't have meant anything. I had just moved into a new apartment complex, a quiet, older building with beige walls and dimly lit hallways. Nothing fancy, but comfortable. My unit was on the second floor, and the mailbox for my apartment was a small metal slot at the entrance. The first time I noticed something odd was about a week after I moved in. I pulled open my mailbox, expecting the usual junk mail and bills, but there was only a single piece of paper inside. No envelope, just a folded slip with one sentence written in neat, almost too perfect handwriting. You shouldn't be here. I remember staring at it, waiting for some kind of realization to hit. Was this a mistake? Some prank? Maybe it was meant for the last tenant. I looked around the lobby, but no one was nearby. The air felt heavier, as if the walls were pressing in just a little too close. I tossed the note, trying not to let it get to me. Probably just some bored neighbor messing around. But the next morning, when I checked the mailbox again, there was another note. I mean it. Leave. This time, I felt something colder settle in my stomach. Someone was doing this intentionally. But why? I hadn't met any of my neighbors yet, aside from an older woman on the first floor who had smiled politely when I moved in. Had I done something to upset someone? I decided to ignore it. Whoever was leaving the notes wanted a reaction, and I wasn't going to give them one. But then, things started shifting. One evening, as I was heading up to my apartment, I noticed my door was slightly ajar. Not enough to be obvious, but just open enough to make my heart pound in my ears. I hesitated before stepping inside, scanning the small space. Nothing seemed missing. Nothing was out of place. But I was sure I had locked the door when I left that morning. I checked the lock. It was perfectly fine. No sign of forced entry. The deadbolt still functioned. Had I just been careless? I told myself I must have been distracted and hadn't pulled it shut all the way. That night, I barely slept. A few days later, I finally ran into another tenant, a man who lived in the unit across from mine. He was tall, with a shaved head and a blank, unreadable face. We exchanged polite hellos, and I casually mentioned the notes I had been finding in my mailbox. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker, something too quick for me to fully catch. Then he smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. People around here keep to themselves, he said. There was something final in his tone, like a warning. After that, I started noticing things more. When I walked through the halls, I had the distinct feeling that doors shut just as I passed. Conversations lowered to hushed tones when I entered the lobby. The old woman on the first floor, the one who had smiled so kindly when I moved in, now refused to meet my eyes when I greeted her. She would turn and walk in the opposite direction, as if acknowledging me was dangerous. Then there were the sounds. Late at night, I began to hear something moving inside the walls. A slow, deliberate scratching like fingernails dragging across wood. Sometimes it was accompanied by soft murmurs, low voices that seemed to weave in and out of the white noise of the building. I convinced myself it was the pipes or rats or some kind of structural issue. But the night I woke up to find my closet door wide open, when I knew I had shut it before bed, that was the night I started packing. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But the final straw came when I checked my mailbox one last time before deciding to leave. Inside was no note this time, just an old, faded photograph. It was of my apartment door, taken from outside in the hallway. and scrawled across the bottom in that same perfect handwriting were the words, "Too late." I left that night, abandoning half my belongings in my rush to get out. I never got answers. I never found out who left the notes or how they got inside my apartment. But sometimes I still dream of that place, of the shifting shadows in the hall, the murmurs in the walls. And every now and then, when I check my mailbox in my new apartment, I hesitate, heart pounding, half expecting to find another note waiting for me. Because whatever was there, I don't think it was just the building, and I don't think it's done with me yet. I first noticed something odd on an otherwise ordinary morning. I woke up to the sound of my alarm, the familiar beep slicing through the haze of sleep. I followed my usual routine, showering, dressing, grabbing a cup of coffee, and left my apartment with no inkling that anything was amiss. The streets looked the same, the people the same, yet a subtle feeling of dislocation clung to me, as if reality itself had taken a slight detour overnight. On my walk to the bus stop, I passed the same corner shop I'd seen every day for years. But today, the display in the window was arranged differently. The usual assortment of newspapers and trinkets had been replaced by an oddly symmetrical pattern of objects I couldn't quite place. A red vase, a small clock, and a faded postcard, all lined up as if by design. I paused, rubbed my eyes, and told myself it was just my imagination. Yet, as the bus pulled up and I stepped aboard, the nagging sense that something was off lingered. At work, the glitches grew more pronounced. In the break room, I reached for my usual mug from the shelf, only to find it wasn't there. Instead, a nearly identical mug, but with a different inscription, sat in its place. I distinctly remembered putting my own mug on the shelf the night before. I mentioned it to a coworker, expecting a quick, "You must have forgotten where you left it," but she shook her head and replied, "I don't recall that mug ever being here." Her tone was gentle, yet dismissive, as if I were overreacting. I started to wonder if my memory was playing tricks on me. Later that day, as I made my way home, I encountered a stranger on the sidewalk who seemed hauntingly familiar. I was sure I'd seen him before, maybe at a cafe I frequented, yet when I greeted him, he merely smiled and nodded, his eyes devoid of recognition. It was as if he had been waiting for me, a perfectly repeated cameo in the unfolding scene of my life. I tried to shrug it off, blaming the lingering effects of sleep, but an unsettling chill ran down my spine. Back at home, things continued to defy logic. I entered my apartment and immediately noticed that the layout of my living room was subtly different. The armchair that I'd left by the window the night before now sat flush against the wall, and my coffee table was in a place I didn't remember arranging. I walked around, touching the furniture as if to confirm its presence, but every detail felt wrong, almost as if the room had been reassembled while I wasn't looking. I took a deep breath and chalked it up to a trick of my mind, trying to convince myself that perhaps I was just more tired than usual. Days passed in a similar pattern. Every morning, I would awaken to slight discrepancies. A book that wasn't on its usual shelf, a painting that seemed to have shifted on the wall, or the sound of my own footsteps echoing in an empty hallway when I was sure I was alone. I began documenting these changes in a journal, noting the time and details, but each entry only deepened the mystery. I even started snapping photos on my phone, comparing them to my recollections, and in every image I found minute differences that defied explanation. Then something even stranger happened. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I walked past a reflective window and caught sight of myself, a version of me that didn't quite match. My reflection moved in perfect synchronization for a moment, but then it hesitated, its expression frozen in a look of quiet dread. I stared at it, heart pounding, convinced that I'd just witnessed a glitch in my own existence. When I turned around, the hallway was empty, and the normal rhythm of life resumed. Yet the memory of that moment would not fade. I tried discussing these incidents with friends and family, but every time I mentioned the subtle shifts, they laughed it off as stress or an overactive imagination. "Everything's fine, you're just tired," they would say, their voices reassuring yet oblivious to the mounting inconsistencies I experienced. Their dismissals only heightened my anxiety, and I found myself increasingly isolated, trapped in a loop of repetitive and altered moments that only I seemed to notice. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I noticed something that shattered any remaining hope for normalcy. I had been watching a movie, completely absorbed, when the scene on the screen froze mid-dialogue. I glanced around and realized that for a split second, time in my living room itself had stuttered. The ticking of the clock on the wall halted, the hum of the refrigerator fell silent, and even the shadows in the room seemed to pause. Then, as abruptly as it stopped, everything resumed, leaving me trembling and disoriented. I began to suspect that these were not mere coincidences or my mind playing tricks. Every day, the world around me seemed to reset itself, as if reality were being reprogrammed without my consent. The repetition of moments, the misplaced objects, the altered reflections, all of it pointed to a singular, unnerving truth. The fabric of my existence was fraying. I was caught in a perpetual loop of glitches, a broken simulation where every detail was subject to change at a whim. Now, as I sit in this flickering half-light, I feel the weight of a reality that has betrayed me. I've come to accept that the world I once knew may be nothing more than an elaborate facade, one that has been corrupted by inexplicable, incessant glitches. I no longer know if I'm witnessing these events in real time or if they're echoes of a reality that is no longer stable. Every morning I wake with a lingering dread, wondering if the changes I observe will escalate further, if someday I'll wake up to find that I too have been altered beyond recognition. The realization that haunts me now is simple yet devastating. I may never return to what once felt normal. I've become an unwilling participant in a grand, malfunctioning matrix, a loop of inconsistencies and broken moments that defies logic and reason. I stare out the window at a world that looks familiar, yet is undeniably alien, and I wonder if there's any escape. In this glitching reality, I am both observer and observed, trapped in an endless cycle where every change blurs the line between what's real and what's not. And with every passing day, I feel more certain that I am no longer living in a stable world, but in a fragmented illusion that I may never fully leave behind. It started on an ordinary evening when I returned home from work, expecting the same comfortable routine I'd grown accustomed to. I opened my apartment door and stepped into a space that looked entirely unchanged. The same muted lighting, the same familiar furniture arranged just as I left it, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator. I set down my bag and glanced at my favorite ceramic mug sitting on the small table by the window, the very mug I always made a point to place there every night. I paused for a moment, noticing nothing unusual until later that night, when I looked again and the mug was still there, exactly as I'd left it. It was as if nothing had happened at all, yet an unsettling thought gnawed at me. Why did it feel so deliberate, so fixed in place? The next day, my routine began to fray at the edges. On my drive to work, I noticed a sleek, dark sedan parked along the side of the road. I distinctly recalled passing by earlier that morning without ever noticing a car in that spot. Then, later in the day, I spotted it again at the coffee shop where I grabbed my usual latte, its presence as persistent and silent as a shadow. The car never seemed to start its engine, never left its spot, and yet it kept appearing in exactly the same place at seemingly random intervals. I mentioned it to a coworker, expecting a shared experience, but she simply smiled and said she'd never seen anything unusual. As the days wore on, the glitches grew subtler, yet more pervasive. One afternoon, after a long day at work, I returned home and walked into my living room. Everything appeared exactly as it always did. The armchair in its usual position, the bookshelf lined up against the wall with its familiar titles. But when I moved toward the coffee table, a small detail caught my eye, a tiny scratch on the frame of the painting I'd hung there, something I was certain hadn't been there the day before. I stood frozen for a moment, straining to recall any reason for that imperfection. It was as if the world around me was resetting itself, replaying the same scenes with minute differences that only I could detect. Then came the moments that made me question the very nature of time. I began to experience disjointed gaps in my memory, One morning, I woke up disoriented, unable to recall how I'd spent the previous few hours. My phone showed a series of notifications and messages that I was sure I'd already seen, yet there was no memory of responding or even reading them. I started noticing repeated conversations with friends that looped in my mind, words and phrases echoing as if recorded and played back. Every time I attempted to pin down these gaps, I found only a haze of forgotten moments, like pages missing from a book I was trying desperately to read. Late one night, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights, I noticed something even more disturbing. The same person passing by the street below, not once but twice in the same interval. The figure, a man in a dark jacket, appeared to walk the same route repeatedly, his silhouette merging with the shadows as if choreographed. I blinked and looked again, and though I was convinced he was the same person, each time his posture and expression subtly shifted. It wasn't just the man, it was every detail that day. A street lamp flickered in a pattern I had seen before. A shop window displayed an arrangement that repeated with slight modifications, and even the sound of a distant siren felt recycled. Determined to make sense of it all, I began meticulously documenting every anomaly. I took photos of my apartment each night, scrutinizing every frame for discrepancies. I kept a journal of conversations and events, noting down every instance where something seemed off, a misplaced object, a repeated encounter, a familiar scene that reappeared with slight, inexplicable differences. Yet, every piece of evidence only deepened the mystery. The images on my phone showed the same mug in the same spot, the same car parked in the same location, and the same scratches on the painting as if they were part of a loop program. My notes revealed a timeline that refused to adhere to the normal progression of time, as if I were living in a world where moments could be copied, pasted, and reassembled without my knowledge. I tried sharing my findings with friends and colleagues, but each time I described what I was experiencing, they responded with gentle reassurances that I must be overworked or simply misremembering. "It's just life playing tricks on you," they said. But deep down, I couldn't shake the growing conviction that there was a deliberate pattern to these events, a system at work, quietly rewriting reality while I was left to notice every glitch. One evening, as I sat alone in my living room with the lights dimmed, I stared fixedly at the mug on the table. In that moment, the familiar object felt loaded with significance, a small piece of a puzzle that I was beginning to realize was far larger than I ever imagined. The repetition of that one simple item was emblematic of everything else that had been happening. The car that always reappeared, the scratch that manifested on a painting, the recurring figure in the shadows. It all began to coalesce into an unsettling theory. I wasn't just observing glitches in the fabric of my daily life. I was living in a system that was malfunctioning, a reality that was programmed to repeat itself with slight, uncanny variations. As the days blurred into one another, my initial anxiety gave way to a resigned fascination. I became both a detective and a prisoner in this looped existence, obsessively recording every detail, trying to decipher the language of these glitches. I wondered if I was somehow integrated into this system, an unwitting participant in a grand, cosmic experiment where reality was nothing more than a series of repeated patterns. Perhaps the world I once believed in, the steady, predictable progression of time and space, was nothing more than an illusion, a digital construct with hidden errors. Now, as I write these words, I sit in a room that seems almost too perfect in its repetition, aware of the small inconsistencies that pepper every moment of my life. I stare out the window at a familiar street, the same car idling in the same spot, and I can't help but feel that I have become part of a malfunctioning program, one in which I am both observer and subject, trapped in an endless cycle of repeated scenes and subtle variations. I confront the terrifying possibility that reality might be fake, that everything I once trusted is merely an elaborate illusion. And in that confrontation, I am left with a question that echoes through each glitch and every repeated moment. Does it even matter if we're part of a program, or if our lives are nothing more than lines of code in a broken simulation? I no longer know if there's any escape from this loop, or if I've become irreversibly entangled in a system that no longer obeys the rules of what I once called normal. I first noticed something was off on a chilly autumn evening, right after I moved into my new apartment. At first, it was nothing more than a few missing items. A pair of coasters I distinctly remembered placing on the coffee table vanished. A cushion from the sofa that I always left in a certain position was inexplicably missing. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness or the chaos of moving, but a nagging feeling of unease lingered in the back of my mind. Over the next few days, I began to see small changes that I couldn't explain. I'd return home from work and find the light in the hallway dimmer than usual, even though the bulb was the same and I had never touched the switch. A book I'd just set on a shelf was sometimes in a different order than before, as if it had been deliberately rearranged. At first, I tried to rationalize these occurrences. Maybe it was just my imagination, a trick of memory in a new place. But the changes grew more unsettling. One morning, I discovered faint, unfamiliar marks on the wall near my bedroom door, as if someone had pressed their hand against it. The marks were not smudges or accidental fingerprints. They were deliberate, arranged in a pattern that I couldn't decipher. I mentioned it to my neighbor, an older gentleman who'd been friendly since I moved in, but he just frowned and said, "That's odd. I haven't seen that before," before quickly changing the subject. Then it began to escalate. Objects started disappearing from their usual spots. I would set my keys on the entry table, only to find them later on the kitchen counter or even in the bathroom. My favorite mug, with its quirky, hand-painted design, would reappear on my bedside table after I was sure I'd left it in the living room. At first, I wondered if I was sleepwalking or if some invisible force was rearranging my belongings. I set up my phone to record, thinking I might catch a glimpse of a shadow or a fleeting movement, but the recordings turned up empty, only the silent, unchanging interior of my apartment. I tried to confide in friends about what was happening, describing the uncanny disappearance of items and the strange marks that now adorn my walls. They listened politely, offering vague reassurances like, "Maybe you're just stressed," or "It's probably nothing." My attempts to get someone to acknowledge the phenomenon only deepened my isolation. I even approached my landlord, who inspected my apartment and declared it to be in perfect order. Yet I knew every night when I locked the door, something unseen was rearranging the world I thought I controlled. Then came the night that shattered my remaining sense of normalcy. I was lying in bed when I heard a soft thump coming from the living room. Heart pounding, I crept out of my bedroom and peered around the corner. The room was dark, lit only by the glow of the city through the window, but in the faint light, I noticed my couch was not in its usual spot. Instead, it was pushed slightly toward the center of the room, as if someone had deliberately moved it during the night. I stepped forward, only to see a thin line of scratches on the floor beneath where the couch had always been, a trail that led to a corner of the room that I rarely used. The scratches were shallow, almost like a whispered warning, but they sent chills down my spine. I started keeping a detailed journal, documenting every small change, every inexplicable movement of objects, every mark that appeared overnight. The entries began to paint a picture of my life slowly unraveling, as if my apartment were part of a larger, malevolent design. I noticed that these glitches in my environment were not random. They followed a pattern that seemed to grow more deliberate with each passing day. Even my own memories started to blur. Conversations with friends, details of my daily routine, all seemed to shift imperceptibly whenever I recalled them. I began to wonder if my mind was somehow being tampered with, if the very fabric of my reality was being rewritten without my consent. Late one night, after a particularly disturbing day of unexplained events, I sat in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside. I stared at the spot on the wall where the mysterious marks had begun, and I realized with a sinking dread that I felt watched, not by an intruder, but by the apartment itself. It was as if the walls, the furniture, even the floorboards were alive, orchestrating a slow, relentless transformation of everything I once knew. The once familiar space was no longer my sanctuary, but a shifting labyrinth where nothing remained constant. I tried to rationalize these occurrences, to convince myself that it was all in my head, that stress or exhaustion could account for such anomalies. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play, a force that thrived on change, on the slow erosion of what I considered normal. I wondered if I was trapped in some sort of closed loop or alternate reality where every small detail was manipulated by an unseen hand. I scoured online forums, reading accounts from others who claimed to have experienced similar phenomena, but nothing ever matched the creeping, pervasive sense of dread that had taken root in my heart. Now, as I write these words, I am left with an unsettling question that haunts every moment of my waking life. Is this merely a series of coincidences and figments of an overactive imagination, or have I stumbled into a situation where reality itself is being tampered with? Each time I return home, I face the same familiar layout, yet every detail has subtly changed, as if the world is slowly morphing into something unrecognizable, a sinister version of what I once knew. I cannot shake the feeling that I am being drawn deeper into a trap, a closed loop from which there is no escape, where every small, unexplainable event is part of a much larger, incomprehensible picture. And so, I am left in a state of constant unease, forever questioning whether the changes are real or if I am simply losing my grip on reality, while somewhere in the shadows, something watches and waits for the next shift to occur. I first encountered him on a rainy evening while I was waiting for a bus near the corner of Maple and Fifth. The drizzle blurred the neon signs, and the city's pulse felt slow and tired. I remember thinking how odd it was to see a lone figure smiling warmly under an awning. He was of average build, wearing a worn leather jacket and a cap pulled low over his eyes. As the bus pulled up, he greeted me with a nod and a soft good evening before disappearing into the rain. At the time, I dismissed him as another lonely soul caught in the drudgery of a wet night, but the memory of that kind, almost familiar smile lingered in my mind. A few days later, I met him again, this time at the small grocery store near my apartment. I was picking up a few essentials when I noticed him in the produce section. He was there, examining a display of apples, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. "Fancy meeting you here," he said, his tone casual, yet carrying an undercurrent of recognition that I couldn't place. I managed a polite smile and a brief hello before hurrying to the checkout, feeling inexplicably exposed under his gaze. It was strange. I was sure I'd never seen him before, yet his presence felt oddly personal, as if he knew me. Over the following weeks, our paths began to cross with increasing regularity. I started spotting him in places where I would least expect him. At a friend's birthday party, in the park during an early morning jog, even outside the coffee shop where I attempted to lose myself in a book. At first, I told myself these were mere coincidences, random encounters that held no deeper meaning. But then, subtle details began to emerge that I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, while I was working at a local co-working space, I overheard him speaking with someone on the phone. He mentioned details about my routine, the cafe I frequented, the route I took to work that I had never disclosed to anyone. It sent a chill down my spine. Then came the unnerving compliments and questions that bordered on the invasive. On one encounter, he commented on how serene I looked when I was lost in thought by the fountain in the park, adding that he had noticed I always sat there on Wednesday afternoons. I laughed it off, attributing it to an eccentric observer, but the precision of his observation unsettled me. Another time, he remarked casually, "I saw you at the book fair last month. You were the one buying that rare edition of Poe. You have impeccable taste." I never mentioned my interest in Poe to anyone, and I couldn't fathom how he could have known such a detail. Each encounter left me more anxious, as if he were piecing together a puzzle about my life that only he understood. The strangest moments were when I felt most vulnerable. After a particularly difficult day at work, I returned home to find a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a handwritten note in neat, flowing script. "I know your secrets, and I admire your strength." I trembled as I read it, my mind racing with questions. How did he know about the struggles I had confided in my diary? Was it possible that someone had been reading it, or was this message meant solely for me? I tried to convince myself that it was a bizarre coincidence or an ill-conceived prank. Yet every fiber of my being screamed that I was being watched. My attempts to rationalize the situation only deepened my unease. I began altering my routines, taking different routes to work, avoiding my usual spots at the park, even changing the time I went to the grocery store. But no matter what I did, his presence seemed to shadow me. I once caught a glimpse of him peeking from behind a tree near my apartment building's entrance as I returned late at night, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my heart pound. Another time, while waiting for an elevator in my office building, I noticed that the security camera feed on my phone inexplicably showed his reflection in the glass door, even though no one else was there. Desperation drove me to confront him directly. On a chilly evening, I waited by the bus stop, determined to ask him about the unsettling coincidences. When he appeared, as he often did, I mustered the courage to speak. "Why do you keep following me? How do you know so much about my life?" I asked, my voice trembling. He simply smiled, a smile that no longer held warmth, but something unreadable, and replied, "I'm just a friend, someone who cares. Don't you feel less alone knowing someone understands you?" His words were gentle, yet invasive, and they echoed in my mind long after he had walked away. Now, as I sit in the quiet darkness of my apartment, every creak and whisper of the wind seems to carry his presence. I've scoured social media, spoken to mutual acquaintances, and even considered filing a police report, but there's no trace of him beyond these unnerving encounters. My rational mind desperately clings to the notion of coincidences. Yet the evidence feels too precise, too intentional to be dismissed as chance. I'm left grappling with a haunting question. Is he truly just a friendly stranger with an uncanny knack for being in the right place at the right time? Or is there something more sinister at work? A calculated, obsessive interest in my life that defies logic? Each night, as I double-check the locks on my door and peer out the window into the inky blackness, I wonder if I'm being tracked by someone who knows every move I make. The line between coincidence and deliberate surveillance blurs into a haze of paranoia. I've tried to find logical explanations for the strange details. The rare book, the misplaced envelope, the uncanny recollections, but nothing adds up. And so, I remain suspended in this unsettling limbo, haunted by the possibility that the friendly stranger I once thought harmless might be the beginning of something far more dangerous. Is it all in my head? Or is someone really following my every move? I can't help but shudder at the thought that his presence might be just the first chapter in a story that I'm powerless to control. I moved into a new apartment in mid-October, thinking a change of scenery would be a fresh start. The building was a modest, old structure in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing too fancy, but it had character. The first few days were pleasant enough. I unpacked my few belongings, arranged my favorite chair by the window, and even managed to smile at the friendly neighbor, Mr. Holloway, who always greeted me with a nod in the hallway. Everything felt normal, even comforting, as if I'd finally found my little haven. But then small things began to change. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned home to find that the armchair I had placed by the window had been moved to the center of the living room. I distinctly remembered setting it down there. I asked myself if I had rearranged it in a haze of exhaustion, but I was sure I hadn't. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee, I noticed that a family photo I'd hung above the mantel had been shifted by a few inches. It wasn't a huge difference, but it unsettled me. I mentioned it to Mr. Holloway in passing, but he only gave a polite smile and said, "Must be you, sometimes you can't see the little changes in an old building." I wasn't convinced. Over the following weeks, the changes grew more frequent and peculiar. I would enter my apartment after work, and objects would be slightly out of place. The stack of mail I left on the kitchen counter would be rearranged, as if someone had carefully sorted through it, though I was the only one who had the key. The wallpaper in the hallway seemed to have new, subtle patterns at times, lines that weren't there before, as if someone had repainted them overnight. I started noticing that the floorboards creaked in different spots, almost as if footsteps had been treading a different path than my own. At first, I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness or the building settling, but soon I began to see a pattern. The changes, while minor individually, were becoming consistent, a slow, deliberate reordering of my space. Then came the messages. One day, tucked under the door, I found a small note on plain paper that simply read, "It's not what you think." I panicked for a moment and asked the building manager, but he insisted he hadn't seen anything like that and suggested I was just stressed from the move. My calls to friends were met with similar reassurances. Nothing unusual was happening, just a few odd coincidences that my mind was overreacting to. My unease deepened when I began noticing changes in the people around me. Mr. Holloway, who once greeted me warmly every morning, now seemed distant, his smile forced as if he were reciting lines from a script. At the local grocery store, the cashier, someone I chatted with a couple of times, gave me a curt nod and avoided any small talk. I even overheard a conversation between two neighbors that hinted at something unsettling. One mentioned that the apartment seems different these days, as if they too had sensed a shift, though they quickly dismissed it as imagination. But I knew it wasn't just in my head. Late one night, I couldn't sleep. The silence of the apartment was punctuated by a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere behind the walls. I lay awake, heart pounding, convinced that the very structure of my home was changing around me. My phone's clock would sometimes freeze on a particular second, and when it resumed, it felt as though time had skipped forward. I began to dread the moments of solitude when I was left alone with my thoughts, and the creeping suspicion that everything I had known was being manipulated. One evening, determined to confront these inexplicable occurrences, I stayed up recording video in my living room. I wanted to catch evidence of the subtle shifts. At first, the footage was ordinary, but then I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. In the background of the recording, for a fraction of a second, I saw a shadow, an indistinct figure that shouldn't have been there. When I rewound the tape, the figure was gone, replaced by the familiar clutter of my living room. I showed the video to a friend, hoping for validation, but he dismissed it as a technical glitch, insisting that I was tired and overthinking. Every explanation felt hollow. The more I tried to rationalize, the more the anomalies multiplied. One day, while returning from work, I found my mailbox had been rearranged. Letters that had once been inside were now scattered on the ground, and nothing was missing. Then, in the evening, I discovered a fresh smear of what looked like black ink on the hallway wall, a pattern that, upon closer inspection, resembled a symbol I'd never seen before. It was as if someone was leaving breadcrumbs, a message that I was meant to decipher, but its meaning eluded me entirely. The final break came on a rainy Sunday. I had planned to spend the day cleaning, trying to restore some sense of order to my increasingly chaotic environment. As I dusted the shelves in my living room, I found a newspaper clipping tucked behind a book. It was dated several months ago and mentioned a series of unsolved disturbances in our building. Strange rearrangements, missing items, and odd occurrences that residents had dismissed as pranks. My heart sank as I read the article. I had assumed it was just an urban legend, but now it felt all too real. I confronted the manager again, demanding answers, but he simply shrugged and said, "Sometimes buildings have their quirks," as if my concerns were trivial. Now, as I sit in the dark of my apartment with the rain tapping against the windows, I feel utterly alone in my perception of a world that no one else seems to acknowledge. Every time I step into a room, there's a lingering feeling that something is off, that the space is not quite what I left it. The familiar faces of my neighbors and friends now were expressions of practiced normalcy, their smiles and reassurances empty and unconvincing. I fear that I am trapped in a slowly shifting reality, a closed loop where everything I once took for granted is being subtly, yet deliberately, altered. I have no answers, only an unshakable sense of dread. It's not just a series of coincidences or my imagination running wild. It's something much darker, something inexplicable that has taken root in the very fabric of my world. And as I write this, I know deep down that I may never escape this feeling of being an outsider in my own life, a prisoner of a reality that everyone else seems blissfully unaware of. I first noticed him the day after I moved into my new apartment complex on Pinecrest Lane. I was busy unpacking boxes and trying to settle into my new space when a knock at the door startled me. When I opened it, there he was, a man with an unassuming smile and polite mannerisms who introduced himself as Eric. my new neighbor from apartment 3B. At first, I was grateful for his friendly gesture. After all, starting over in a new place can be lonely. Our early interactions were light, filled with casual conversation about the weather, local news, and neighborhood quirks. However, as days turned into weeks, I began to notice that Eric's behavior was not as benign as it first appeared. In our subsequent encounters, his questions grew more personal and intrusive. He asked about my daily routines, my work hours, and even the names of people I visited regularly. It wasn't simply friendly curiosity. It felt as though he were meticulously cataloging every detail of my life. I brushed it off as a quirk of his personality, perhaps a habit from a previous job or a misguided attempt at neighborly concern. But then the compliments started. At first, they were vague, remarks on how I kept my apartment neat or how my smile brightened the hallway. Soon, they evolved into odd, almost obsessive comments. "I noticed how you arranged your bookshelf so perfectly," he once remarked, his eyes fixed on mine in a way that made my skin crawl. "You really know how to make a space feel like home," he added during another encounter, as if my inner world were a puzzle he was determined to solve. I began to observe Eric more closely, trying to determine whether there was any hidden malice behind his unnerving politeness. One evening, after returning from work, I saw him lingering outside the building's entrance. He wasn't engaged in conversation with anyone, merely standing there, watching the rain cascade down the street. A chill ran down my spine as I hurried inside, locking my door behind me. Later that night, while attempting to relax by reading in my living room, I noticed something disturbing, a small object, a keychain I didn't recognize, sitting on my coffee table. I remembered placing it in my desk drawer. Was it misplaced? Or had Eric somehow taken an interest in my personal belongings? My suspicions only deepened when I began receiving anonymous text messages. Each brief note was a string of unsettling compliments and probing questions about my daily habits, written in a tone eerily similar to Eric's. I couldn't shake the feeling that these messages were designed to unsettle me, to remind me that someone was watching my every move. When I finally confronted him in the hallway, his response was disarmingly vague. "I'm just a concerned neighbor," he said with a nonchalant shrug, his eyes glinting with an unreadable emotion. I wanted to dismiss it as a misunderstanding, yet deep down, my instinct screamed that something was very wrong. As the weeks progressed, the situation escalated in ways both subtle and alarming. Everyday occurrences began to feel manipulated. Items in my apartment would mysteriously change places. A book from my nightstand appeared on the kitchen counter. My mail was rearranged as if sorted by someone else. One night, I even caught a glimpse of Eric outside my window, his face pressed against the glass, as if he were ensuring I was never truly alone. The constant sensation of being observed became almost unbearable, and I found myself double-checking locks and peering through drawn curtains. Each time I mentioned these incidents to friends or family, they insisted I was overreacting, that I was letting my imagination run wild. Yet, the mounting evidence in my own eyes left me questioning their dismissals. One particularly dismal evening, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. The rain pounded relentlessly on the pavement, and the deserted streets echoed with the sound of my own footsteps. As I passed a small, dimly lit park, I noticed a lone figure standing under a flickering streetlight. At first, I assumed it was nothing more than a trick of the rain, a distorted reflection in a puddle perhaps. But as I drew closer, my heart sank. It was Eric, standing perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the empty park with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I instinctively crossed the street to avoid him, but I soon realized he was following at a measured distance, as if ensuring I never truly escaped his notice. Panic surged through me, and I quickened my pace until, finally, the rain-washed alley swallowed him up. Now, as I write this, I constantly look over my shoulder, haunted by the thought that Eric might be lurking just out of sight. I have begun meticulously documenting every encounter, every unnerving conversation, and every inexplicable movement of my belongings. With each new detail, my unease grows, leaving me to wonder if I am simply misinterpreting a series of harmless interactions, or if I have unwittingly invited a dangerous presence into my life. Every polite greeting and seemingly random compliment now carries a weight of suspicion. I cannot decide whether I'm overreacting to the oddities of an eccentric neighbor or if I'm being subtly manipulated by someone with darker intentions. The lines between genuine concern and calculated intrusion have blurred to the point where I question my own judgment. I leave this account not only as a record of what I have experienced, but also as a warning. Sometimes the most unassuming strangers can mask intentions far more sinister than a friendly smile. As I lock my door tonight and peer into the inky darkness beyond, I cannot shake the feeling that Eric, or someone like him, could be anywhere watching, waiting. And so, I remain suspended in uncertainty, haunted by the question of whether my fear is justified or if I have simply let my imagination spiral out of control. Forgetting where I place my keys, misplacing my phone, walking into a room, and completely blanking on why I was there. Normal things that happen to everyone. I told myself I was just tired, overworked, but then I began losing time. One night, I was watching a show on my laptop, my fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of a coffee mug. I remember hearing the clock ticking softly in the background, the hum of my refrigerator filling the silence. I blinked, and suddenly the screen was dark. My coffee was cold, and the clock, the same one I had just heard ticking minutes before, now read 3:12 a.m. I had no memory of the past 3 hours. The next morning, I convinced myself I had dozed off, even though I didn't feel tired, even though I hadn't been the slightest bit sleepy when I sat down. I went about my day like normal, but something sat heavy in my chest. A deep, quiet dread that I couldn't shake. The missing time became more frequent. I'd be at work typing an email, and in what felt like the next moment, I'd be outside, halfway down the street with no recollection of leaving my desk. I checked my sent mail, and the email had been written, typed out in my own style, using my own words, but I had no memory of doing it. The worst part was when people started acting off. A coworker, Lisa, approached me one afternoon and started chatting about a conversation we'd had the night before. "Thanks for the advice," she said, smiling. "It really helped." I laughed nervously. "What advice?" She frowned. "You told me to go for it. You said I shouldn't be afraid to take risks." I had no memory of this. No memory of texting her, of talking to her at all after work. But when I checked my phone later, there was a full conversation in my message history, my responses clear as day. I had apparently given Lisa a long, heartfelt message, full of details and reassurances. But I didn't remember a single word of it. The days blurred together. I would wake up in different positions than when I fell asleep, sometimes with clothes I didn't remember putting on. My fridge contained food I didn't remember buying. I found a book on my nightstand, a book I had never owned, never read, but with a bookmark placed neatly in the middle, as if I had been reading it for days. I told myself I was just stressed, that maybe I was sleepwalking, but the truth sat in my stomach like a sickness. And then there was the mirror. One morning, as I stood in front of the bathroom sink, brushing my teeth, I noticed something was wrong with my reflection. At first, I couldn't place it. Everything was where it should be, same hair, same tired eyes. But then I moved, and for the briefest moment, my reflection didn't move with me. I dropped my toothbrush, my stomach twisting. It was so fast, so subtle, that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But I knew. Something wasn't right. After that, it got worse. I started hearing my own voice when I wasn't speaking. Soft murmurs just out of range. Whispers that I couldn't quite make out. When I checked my phone, I found recordings I had no memory of making, audio files of me talking to someone. My voice low and calm, speaking in tones I didn't recognize. But the other side of the conversation? Silence. I started leaving notes for myself, trying to track what I was doing, but they would disappear. Or worse, I would find new ones, notes I didn't remember writing. "You are safe. It's okay. Don't fight it." I tried to tell a friend about what was happening, but before I could, she cut me off. "You already told me," she said, tilting her head. "Last week, we talked about this, remember?" But I didn't remember. One night, I woke up standing in my living room, staring out the window. My hands were pressed against the glass. and I had no idea how long I had been standing there. The street outside was empty, except for one thing. A figure stood on the sidewalk directly across from my apartment. It was too dark to see their face, but I could feel them watching me. I didn't move. I couldn't. And then they lifted their hand, not to wave, but to press their palm against the air, mirroring the way my own hands were pressed against the window. I don't remember what happened after that. I don't remember going back to bed. But when I woke up the next morning, my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked different. Just slightly. Just enough to make my stomach turn. And my hands? They were still ice cold. Like I had been standing at the window all night. I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something else is inside of me, slipping into my skin when I'm not aware, speaking in my voice when I'm not listening. I've started keeping my phone recording at night, but every time I play it back, all I hear is silence, except for one night. 3 nights ago, I heard myself whisper something. Just a single, quiet sentence in the darkness. I'm not alone. I don't know who I was talking to. I don't know if I was the one speaking at all. But every morning, when I wake up, the first thing I do is check my reflection. Because one of these days, I'm afraid it won't move when I do. I remember that night as if it were etched into my mind with a cold, unforgiving blade. I had just finished a late shift at a rundown gas station on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you pass by without giving it a second thought. It was nearing midnight, and the only company was the steady hum of the fluorescent lights and the whisper of wind rustling through barren trees. As I tidied up the counter, I noticed a man lingering outside by the pump. At first, his presence seemed innocuous, a tired traveler seeking refuge from the chill. But something about his stillness and the way he observed the neon sign made me uneasy. His eyes, dark and unblinking, tracked every movement inside the station. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt as if he were waiting for something or someone. After my shift, I walked to my car in the shadowed lot. The man was still there, now partially obscured by the darkness. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was nothing more than an overactive imagination spurred by exhaustion. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me, his gaze piercing through the night. That unnerving sensation clung to me like a second skin throughout the drive home. The following day brought little solace. While out running errands in a nearby strip mall, I encountered a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to the stranger from the gas station. He wore an old, worn-out coat and a hat pulled low, his eyes hidden in shadow. Our eyes met briefly, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod before walking off in a different direction. I tried to mention the odd familiarity of that encounter to a store clerk, but she brushed it off as a trick of the light, a simple case of mistaken identity. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was off, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. Over the next few days, unsettling incidents multiplied. I began noticing small details that I could no longer explain away as mere coincidences. My mailbox, which I had always found in the same spot, was inexplicably moved a few feet from its usual location one morning. The coffee shop I frequented started playing an old, scratchy tune that I distinctly remembered hearing the night I first saw that stranger at the gas station. And every time I passed a reflective window, I thought I caught a glimpse of that same unyielding gaze staring back at me, even when I was alone. Each anomaly compounded my anxiety until I was convinced that these were not random occurrences, but deliberate signals. One particularly stormy evening, I found myself driving along a deserted road near an abandoned industrial complex. The rhythmic patter of rain against the windshield provided a strange sense of comfort amid the darkness. Suddenly, I noticed a car slowly following me, a beat-up sedan with tinted windows. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there he was, the same man from before, sitting motionless in the passenger seat, as if he had been waiting there for ages. My heart pounded in my chest, and an icy dread took over. I instinctively accelerated, weaving through the rain-soaked streets, desperately trying to lose him. I recalled fragments of conversation from a coworker who once mentioned a local legend of a man who appeared before terrible accidents, a spectral figure whose presence signified impending doom. Whether that was mere folklore or something more, I couldn't risk staying in the car any longer. I eventually managed to escape by taking a series of winding back roads, but the memory of his silent, relentless pursuit has never left me. Now, even in the quiet moments of my daily routine, I remain on constant alert, my eyes darting toward every shadow and darkened window. I've learned that this isn't just a trick of my imagination. Friends who have heard my story have confessed similar experiences. Fleeting encounters with a man whose presence defies logical explanation, whose unnerving stare seems to pierce right through the veil of everyday normalcy. I write these words in the dim light of my apartment, still haunted by the recollection of that relentless gaze. I don't know if I will ever fully understand why that stranger chose to intersect with my life, or if his appearances are part of something far more sinister than I can comprehend. All I know is that his presence has left an indelible mark on me, a persistent reminder that danger can lurk in the most unassuming places. As I lock my door each night and peer cautiously into the darkness, I am left with a chilling thought. He could be anywhere, watching, waiting, a spectral embodiment of the unknown. And I am painfully aware that my experience is not unique. Others, too, have felt the silent menace of his gaze. I first noticed something was off on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I woke up to the sound of rain pattering against my window and an inexplicable emptiness that seemed to echo inside me. I reached for my car keys on the small table by the door, only to find nothing but a scattering of papers. I remembered leaving them there the night before, a simple oversight I could easily dismiss. Yet, despite my frantic search through every nook of my new apartment, the keys had vanished without a trace. As the day unfolded, other small anomalies began to appear. On my way to work, I exchanged a polite nod with a neighbor who greeted me warmly, claiming we had spoken just moments earlier. I was certain I'd never met him before, but his tone carried the weight of familiarity. Later, while grabbing coffee at the corner cafe, the barista insisted she had served me that very morning, even though I was certain it was my first visit. I chalked it up to a mix of sleepiness and the chaos of settling into a new place, but a nagging unease crept into my thoughts. Over the next few days, the strange coincidences escalated. Everyday objects in my apartment began to shift places on their own. A framed photograph I'd hung carefully in the living room was later discovered on the kitchen counter, its position slightly altered as if deliberately moved. My favorite mug, which I always kept on the windowsill, was found on the bookshelf instead. I started keeping a detailed journal, writing down the time and location of each occurrence, hoping that a pattern might emerge, a rational explanation that could ease my mounting anxiety. Then came the moments that challenged the very fabric of my reality. One evening, as I prepared dinner, I distinctly heard soft laughter echoing from the hallway, a sound that quickly dissolved into silence when I went to investigate. Later that night, as I passed a mirror in the hallway, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, only to find the corridor empty. When I attempted to describe these events to friends, they responded with blank stares, insisting that nothing unusual had happened. Their inability to recall moments I remembered vividly left me feeling isolated, as if I were the only one experiencing this surreal transformation. The changes did not stop there. People around me began to act as though recent events were mere illusions. At work, a coworker recounted an animated conversation we'd supposedly shared during lunch, a conversation I had no memory of having. A close friend described a deeply personal exchange that, according to her, we had during a recent visit, though I was certain our meeting had been brief and impersonal. It was as if time itself was being rewritten, erasing details from everyone's minds except my own. With every passing day, the world seemed to morph imperceptibly. Familiar faces appeared altered, and conversations looped back on themselves like poorly edited film. I began to feel increasingly like a bystander in my own life, trapped on the sidelines as my world was gradually rearranged into something unrecognizable. The more I documented in my journal, the displaced objects, the contradictory recollections, the eerie sounds, the more I suspected that reality was slipping away, reshaping itself beyond my control. I found no solace in the logical explanations others offered. Instead, I was haunted by the idea that I was the only one who remembered the true version of events, while everyone else lived in a shifting, carefully curated illusion. One particularly stormy night, I returned home to a silence that felt almost oppressive. The lights were off, even though I had left them on earlier, and a faint melody, a tune I couldn't quite place, drifted from somewhere deep within the apartment. Venturing cautiously down the hall, I saw shadows flit at the edge of my vision, each disappearing when I turned to look directly at them. Standing in the dim corridor, I questioned whether these unsettling phenomena were merely tricks of my overtaxed mind, or if they hinted at something more sinister, orchestrating a slow, deliberate rewrite of my reality. Now, as I sit in the flickering glow of my desk lamp, I struggle to piece together the fragments of my unraveling world. My journal is filled with meticulous notes of events that others insist never occurred. I search desperately for any sign that I'm not alone in this shifting nightmare, but every inquiry is met with puzzled looks or outright dismissal. The boundaries between memory and imagination blur with each passing day, and I can no longer tell if I'm the architect of my own confusion or simply a pawn in a larger, unfathomable scheme. I write these words with trembling hands, not knowing if they serve as a record of my descent into madness or as evidence of something far beyond my comprehension. As I switch off the light and listen to the steady patter of rain, I wonder if tomorrow will bring another inexplicable twist, a new alteration to the world I once knew. Am I merely losing my grip on reality, or is some unseen force rearranging the very fabric of my existence? I cannot say for sure. All I know is that I remain suspended between what I remember and what is happening now, desperately clinging to the hope that one day I might uncover the truth behind these disturbing changes, or at least find a way to reclaim the life that now feels like a distant memory. I moved into a new apartment last October, a small one-bedroom on the third floor of an aging brick building that had a charm I couldn't resist. At first, everything felt normal, if not perfectly ordinary, at least comfortably predictable. I arranged my furniture just so, left little trinkets in their places, and made the space my own. But a few days in, I began to notice small, subtle changes that I couldn't quite explain. One evening, after returning from work, I entered my living room and saw my favorite armchair positioned exactly where I remembered leaving it. But then, a few hours later, I passed by the same spot and found the chair moved a few inches to the left, as if nudged by an unseen hand. I told myself I must have forgotten moving it, but I distinctly recalled placing it there earlier. Over the following days, similar occurrences became routine. A vase that had been on the coffee table one moment appeared on a shelf the next, or my stack of magazines on the side table was inexplicably reordered. I tried to chalk it up to my own absent-mindedness. Perhaps I was sleep-deprived from the stress of starting over in a new city. Yet the changes were too consistent, too deliberate. One morning, I found a handwritten note taped to the refrigerator. In neat, precise lettering, it read, "Nothing stays the same." No signature, no explanation, just a message that unsettled me more than I cared to admit. When I mentioned it to a neighbor, he dismissed it as a prank by some mischievous teenager. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that my apartment was not entirely under my control. At work, things were normal enough, but I began noticing disconcerting details there as well. I'd pass by a conference room and see the same calendar on the wall, but on different days, the events listed seemed to shift ever so slightly. A meeting time here, a changed location there, details that no one else seemed to question. I once recalled a conversation with a colleague about an upcoming project, only for her to later insist we had discussed entirely different aspects of it. Each time I tried to pin down these discrepancies, I was met with blank stares or casual reassurances that everything was fine. My own memories started to betray me too. I began writing in a journal, recording every oddity. The misplaced mug on my kitchen counter, the rearranged books on the shelf, the faint scent of perfume in the hallway where no one had walked. I even noted the times I returned to my apartment, expecting to see things exactly as I'd left them, only to find them altered in subtle, yet unmistakable ways. The more I documented, the more I realized that it wasn't just my belongings changing, It felt like the very fabric of my reality was being rewritten when I wasn't looking. One night, after a particularly exhausting day, I came home and flung open my door, expecting the familiar comfort of my personal space. Instead, I was greeted by a living room that looked nearly identical to the one I remembered, except for one horrifying detail. The mirror above the mantel showed a reflection that wasn't mine. For a split second, I saw a stranger, a gaunt, hollow-eyed version of myself, standing behind me. I spun around in the dim light, but the room was empty. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, heart pounding, questioning whether I'd just imagined it. The next morning, everything was as it should be, or so I thought. Each subsequent day brought a new variation of the same unnerving theme. The position of the furniture would subtly shift, messages would appear in unexpected places, and even the layout of the building's corridors seemed to change. I once walked through the hallway of my apartment building and swore I had seen a door painted a different color than the one I remembered. When I mentioned it to the doorman, he simply chuckled and said, "It's the same place, kid. You must be seeing things." But deep down, I knew that wasn't the answer. I began to feel as if I were trapped in a loop, caught in an ever-changing version of my own life. The sense of repetition was maddening. I started to wonder if I was the only one noticing these glitches, or if the world around me was truly shifting in ways that defied logic. The more I tried to cling to the normalcy of my routine, the more everything around me betrayed that sense of stability. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage set. Props moved, scenes rewritten, and I was the only one who realized the script was constantly changing. The final break came one cold, sleepless night. I awoke in the darkness to a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in my living room. I got up, heart pounding, and walked to the source of the noise. There, on the coffee table, lay a single photograph I didn't recognize. It was a black and white image of a room that looked strikingly similar to my own. Yet in the photo, the furniture was arranged differently, and an unknown figure stood in the background, almost blending into the shadows. Beneath the photo, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was a message. "You are not in control." In that moment, a chill ran through me. I realized with dawning horror that I wasn't just witnessing minor changes. I was caught in some kind of closed loop, an alternate reality where nothing remained fixed. The more I tried to assert control over my environment, the more it seemed to slip away, as if an unseen hand were continuously rewriting the rules of my world. Now, as I write this in the dim light of an unfamiliar room, I can't shake the feeling that I've become part of something much larger and far more sinister than I ever imagined. The world I once knew, the one where I could trust my memories and count on the stability of my surroundings, may have been nothing more than an illusion, a carefully constructed facade that is now unraveling before my eyes. I am trapped in this shifting reality, and I fear that I may never escape the endless loop of changes. The question that haunts me is whether it even matters, if reality itself is nothing more than a series of glitches in a system I can no longer comprehend. It started as just another late shift at the bookstore where I worked. It was a small, independent shop nestled between a laundromat and a thrift store, the kind of place that smelled like old paper and wood polish. I loved working there, even on nights when we barely had any customers. It was usually quiet, almost too quiet, but I enjoyed the solitude. That night, I was alone, closing up like usual, doing my final inventory check before shutting off the lights. The door was already locked, the close sign flipped, and the last customer had left nearly an hour ago. I was halfway through organizing a stack of returned books when I heard it, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard in the back corner of the store. My first thought was that someone had come in without me noticing, but that was impossible. The only entrance was the front door, which had been locked for a while. I called out, "Hello," but got no response. The silence that followed was thick, heavy in a way that made my stomach clench. Trying to shake off the unease, I walked towards the back of the store, past rows of towering shelves. There was no one there, just dimly lit aisles and the faint scent of aged paper. I exhaled, telling myself it was just the building settling. But as I turned to head back to the counter, I noticed something odd. One of the books on the nearest shelf was sticking out just slightly. That wasn't unusual. Customers sometimes left books in odd places. But this book had been pulled out just far enough to catch my attention, almost as if someone wanted me to notice. I hesitated before reaching for it. It was an old, tattered hardcover with no title on the spine. When I pulled it out, I felt my chest tighten. The book had no cover art, no markings, just a single name scrawled in faded ink on the first page, mine. That word, written in small, deliberate handwriting, sent a shiver through me. The book wasn't familiar. I had never seen it before, and I had spent years working in that store. As I stared at the name, there was another sound. This time, a faint rustling from deeper in the store, past the storage area. The air suddenly felt wrong, thick, suffocating. My gut told me to leave. Now! I shoved the book back onto the shelf and hurried to the front counter, grabbing my bag with shaky hands. The store felt different now, like something unseen was watching, waiting. I refused to look back as I flipped the breakers, plunging the place into darkness. The moment I stepped outside and locked the door behind me, a wave of relief washed over me. But it didn't end there. The next morning, when I opened up, the book was gone. I searched everywhere, even checked the return pile and the back room, but it had vanished. That alone would have been enough to freak me out, but what truly terrified me was what I found instead. A single sheet of yellowed paper left on the counter where I had been working the night before. On it, in that same faded ink, was a message. I see you now. I quit the bookstore a week later. I never told my boss the real reason why, just that I needed a change. I didn't want to explain something that I couldn't even understand myself. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that I brought something home with me that night. There are moments when I wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like something is just beyond my vision, lingering in the dark. I never found that book again, but I still remember the feeling of holding it, the weight of it in my hands, the way my name, mine, looked inked onto the first page, as if it had been waiting for me all along. Ever since I was a child, I had an uneasy relationship with the old house on the outskirts of our small town, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror I experienced last summer. I had inherited the property from a distant relative I never met, and while everyone warned me about its dark past, I couldn't resist the lure of solitude and the promise of restoring a forgotten relic. The house sat alone among ancient oaks and tangled vines, its windows like blind eyes watching every passerby. From the moment I crossed the threshold, an inexplicable chill crept over me, as though the air itself whispered warnings in a language I couldn't decipher. At first, I chalked up the unsettling sensations to my imagination, fueled by local legends of restless spirits and unspeakable tragedies that had befallen previous inhabitants. But on the third night, while I was sifting through dusty family records in the dim study, I heard soft tapping from the attic, a sound so deliberate and methodical that it froze my blood. The tapping wasn't merely the wind or the creak of old wood. It was as if someone was drumming out a message meant solely for me. I followed the sound up a narrow, creaking staircase, my pulse pounding in my ears until I reached the attic. Moonlight filtered through a grimy window, illuminating a cluster of old trunks and a solitary portrait of a man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that seemed to follow my every move. I felt as if the man in the portrait had locked eyes with me, silently conveying a warning I couldn't ignore. Shaken, I left the attic, but the silence that greeted me was more oppressive than the sound had been. Over the following days, the house revealed its true nature. Footsteps echoed in deserted corridors, shadows danced just beyond the corner of my eye, and soft murmurs of indecipherable words permeated the stillness. I often heard my name whispered in the dark, each syllable laden with a menacing familiarity. One evening, as a storm raged outside and rain hammered the windows, I attempted to leave. Approaching the front door, I found it locked from the inside, as if the house itself was intent on keeping me imprisoned. My phone's signal vanished without warning, isolating me further in a place where every creak and groan of the old wood spoke of unseen malevolence. Desperation gripped me, but there was no escape. The next night, the power abruptly failed. plunging me into an oppressive darkness that swallowed every comforting thought. I fumbled with a flashlight and ventured into the hall, following a faint, unearthly glow that beckoned me toward my bedroom. As I slowly pushed the door open, a spectral figure emerged, a silhouette standing at the foot of my bed, its features indistinct, yet radiating an aura of sorrow and malice. In that frozen moment, time seemed to unravel. The figure receded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind an echo of its presence and a dread that clung to my very soul. I began delving into the history of the house, uncovering disturbing accounts of a man condemned for unspeakable crimes, a figure rumored to have dabbled in occult rituals and bound his essence to the property. I learned that the portrait in the attic was of that very man, a relic of a past steeped in horror and unfinished business. The more I learned, the more I realized that the malevolent force inhabiting the house was not content with mere manifestations. It escalated its presence. Muffled footsteps led to muddy prints trailing from the door to my bed, and disembodied voices recited cryptic dates and names that sent shivers down my spine. I soon understood that the house was feeding on my fear, its supernatural inhabitants growing bolder with every moment I spent trapped within its walls. With each passing day, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred further, until I found myself questioning my own sanity. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of unseen movement, confirmed that I was not alone. Even as I now recount these events, a lingering uncertainty gnaws at me. What does the house truly want? And is there any escape from the cycle of terror it has so meticulously woven around me? In the stillness of the night, I can still hear that slow, deliberate tapping echoing from the attic, a constant reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be unraveled, leaving me with an unsettling dread that the nightmare is far from over. I started noticing that even mirror reflections didn't match reality. On one occasion, I caught a glimpse of a gaunt figure behind me in a window's reflection, a sorrowful silhouette that vanished when I turned around. I began documenting every occurrence, scribbling frantic notes that might serve as proof of the unexplainable horrors dwelling here. The house seemed to manipulate its environment, plunging rooms into sudden cold and then sweltering heat, as if it were breathing alongside me. One harrowing night, while I lay awake listening to the eerie symphony of creaks and whispers, I heard a clear, otherworldly voice reciting words in a language unknown to me. It beckoned me to a part of the house I had never explored, a narrow passage concealed behind a heavy bookshelf in the study. With trembling hands, I shifted the volumes aside and discovered a hidden door leading to a cramped corridor lit by flickering candlelight. The walls of the corridor were inscribed with cryptic symbols, their meanings lost to time, but radiating an aura of dread. At the corridor's end lay a small circular room dominated by a single ornate mirror. My reflection within was distorted, twisted into a version of myself, both familiar and utterly alien. As I stared, the spectral figure reappeared within the glass. A gaunt man with hollow eyes and a mournful expression, his presence suffused with an ancient sorrow. I could not tear my gaze away, as if the mirror were compelling me to confront a dark destiny. I share this account in the hope that someone, somewhere, might understand the true horror lurking beneath the veneer of our everyday world. I do not know if my words will ever be believed or if I will ever escape this relentless nightmare. But one thing remains certain. The house's malevolence will haunt my every breath until I either flee its grasp or become one with its dark legacy. Every day, I wake with a creeping sensation that reality is bending around me, as if the world I know is a fragile facade on the verge of shattering. It began innocently enough, small coincidences that could be attributed to fatigue or stress. I vividly remember one morning, as I was preparing breakfast, noticing that my favorite mug was not on the counter where I'd left it. After a frantic search, I found it perched on the windowsill, as if deliberately moved. I dismissed it as a lapse in attention, a quirk of an overworked mind. A few days later, while returning from a late shift, I encountered a man on the sidewalk whose face sparked an uncanny familiarity. His eyes locked with mine for an instant, and I felt a surge of déjà vu, as though I were meeting an old friend. When I inquired with passersby later, no one recognized him. I tried to rationalize the encounter, attributing it to exhaustion and fleeting memory. Yet, the feeling of being watched and the echo of an unplaceable connection lingered in my mind. Over the following weeks, the anomalies grew bolder. Items in my apartment began disappearing and reappearing in impossible locations. My keys, always placed on a small dish by the door, were sometimes found in the refrigerator or tucked behind a stack of magazines. Initially, I assumed I was simply misplacing them, but the consistency of these occurrences defied explanation. Then there were the sounds, a series of soft murmurs and indistinct voices that drifted through the silence of the night. One evening, while I was absorbed in a book, I distinctly heard laughter and hushed conversation emanating from an empty room. The voices seemed familiar, yet no one was there when I searched. A particularly chilling moment occurred when I caught a glimpse of a figure in the reflection of my bedroom mirror. It was a shadowy silhouette, its features blurred and ever-shifting. I spun around, heart pounding, only to find nothing but the dim outlines of my room. Rational thought insisted it was a trick of the light, a figment of my tired imagination, but the unease only deepened. Determined to uncover a logical explanation, I began documenting every odd occurrence in a worn journal, recording misplaced objects, fleeting figures, and the haunting echoes that defied logic. Desperate for reassurance, I reached out to friends and even sought professional help. They attributed my experiences to stress and sleep deprivation, insisting that my mind was playing tricks on me. One friend even suggested that I might be caught in a blurred line between dreams and wakefulness. However, the meticulous evidence I had gathered, the detailed entries, the inexplicable reappearances, and the uncanny sounds challenged their reassurances. The anomalies were too deliberate to be mere illusions conjured by fatigue. One quiet evening, as I sat at my desk under the soft glow of a lamp, I heard a gentle, rhythmic tapping from the hallway. The sound was deliberate, almost like a heartbeat, yet it vanished as soon as I rose to investigate. I scoured every corner of my apartment, but the source remained elusive. At that moment, a chilling thought gripped me. Was I truly losing my grip on reality, or was something else orchestrating these events from the shadows? Now, as I write these words in the solitude of the night, every sound and shadow seems to carry a hidden significance. The objects that vanish and reappear, the faces that flicker at the edge of my vision, and the voices that whisper in the dark all weave a tapestry of uncertainty. I find myself suspended between reason and a haunting possibility, that there may be layers of existence beyond what I can comprehend. Each anomaly chips away at the certainty of my senses, leaving me to wonder if my experiences are genuine disturbances in reality or mere fragments of a mind on the brink of madness. I am left with one lingering, insistent question. Are these strange occurrences simply the byproducts of an overactive imagination fueled by stress and sleepless nights? Or is there something far more profound at work? A hidden force, an unseen presence, subtly rewriting the rules of existence? Even now, as I listen for another soft tap in the silence, I cannot decide whether the world around me is shifting into an unrecognizable dream or if I am simply unraveling. The truth, if it exists, remains just beyond reach, and I am trapped in a limbo where every misplaced object and every echo of a forgotten laugh blurs the line between what is real and what is imagined. I first noticed something was off on an otherwise ordinary morning. I woke up to a vague disorientation, a feeling that I'd missed minutes, maybe even hours, between sleep and wakefulness. The clock on my bedside table read 7:03 a.m., but I couldn't recall ever setting it to that time. I sat up slowly, trying to shake the uneasy sensation that my mind was playing tricks on me. It wasn't just the lost time, it was the subtle conviction that I wasn't entirely in control of my own thoughts. At first, the changes were small. I'd make my coffee as usual, but sometimes I'd catch myself stirring it absent-mindedly for what felt like an eternity, only to later find that I'd left it untouched. I began to notice moments where I'd say things, and then later, when friends mentioned our conversations, my words were different, altered, as if someone else had edited my speech after the fact. My coworker, Lisa, mentioned that I had laughed at a joke I didn't recall hearing, and when I tried to remember, the memory was hazy, like a dream that had faded by morning light. I chalked it up to stress, maybe even exhaustion from working too hard, but an inexplicable dread began to take root. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I experienced something that shook me to the core. I was on a familiar street, under the soft glow of streetlights, when I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of being watched from within. It wasn't that someone was lurking in the shadows. Rather, I felt as if an unseen presence was inside my head, nudging me, altering my perception of reality. My thoughts became jumbled, and I began to question whether my own decisions were mine at all. I stopped at a corner, heart pounding, as a slow, dissonant whisper echoed in my mind, urging me to turn left instead of right. I obeyed instinctively, even though I had no recollection of wanting to change my route. At home, things continued to deteriorate. I began keeping a detailed journal, hoping that writing everything down would help me cling to some sense of control. But even the journal betrayed me. I'd write a passage in my own hand, only to return later and find entire sections overwritten in a handwriting that wasn't mine. The words sometimes seemed to rearrange themselves, sentences forming that I couldn't remember dictating. My hands would tremble as I read the entries, a clear sign that something deep within me was being manipulated. I tried to show my journal to a close friend, but when he read it, he only saw the neat, familiar script I'd always used. "You must be stressed," he said dismissively, patting my shoulder. But I knew the truth. Something inside me was slowly taking over. The changes weren't limited to my actions. Even my relationships began to shift. My best friend, Mark, who once joked about my quirky sense of humor, started remarking on how distant I'd become. He would bring up past conversations, noting that I had said things I was certain I never said. "You're not the same, man," he'd say, his eyes filled with concern. "It's like you're programmed to behave differently now." I would laugh it off, but inside I was terrified. Was I losing my identity? Was someone, or something, rewriting my memories and altering my behavior like lines of code in a computer program? One night, I experienced the most unnerving episode yet. I was sitting alone in the darkened living room, the only light coming from a flickering lamp on the side table. As I sat there, I began to notice that my thoughts were no longer entirely my own. Ideas would surface, urgent and insistent, urging me to take actions I would never normally consider. I found myself reaching for my phone, typing out messages with words that felt foreign to me, as if an unseen hand was guiding my fingers. When I checked later, the messages were gone, as though they'd never been sent. But the feeling remained, a constant, gnawing awareness that I was being subtly controlled from within. In the days that followed, I started to lose track of time entirely. I'd be engrossed in a conversation with a colleague, only to later learn that several hours had passed, hours that I had no memory of. My own reflection began to seem unreliable. In the mirror, I would catch fleeting images of myself with a vacant stare or a half-smile that I never wore. It was as if my face was an actor on a stage, performing roles I hadn't auditioned for. Every time I tried to piece together my day, I found gaps, missing moments that I couldn't explain, like pages torn out of the story of my life. I reached out to a therapist, desperate for an explanation, but even she was at a loss. "It sounds like you're experiencing episodes of dissociation," she said softly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of something she wouldn't name. I left her office with more questions than answers, feeling more isolated than ever. The unsettling truth was becoming clear. The danger wasn't from an external threat. It was coming from inside me. Something was controlling my actions, my thoughts, and even my memories. Now, as I sit in this dim room, I am haunted by the realization that I may never regain full control over my own mind. Every time I try to assert my will, I feel that intrusive presence push back, rewriting my actions, erasing moments, and replacing them with a carefully curated version of reality. I am trapped in a nightmare where I am both the observer and the observed, a puppet whose strings are pulled by an unseen force. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something far more sinister is at play, but one thing is certain. I will never shake the feeling that I am being controlled from the outside. And as I write these words, I can't help but wonder if my true self is slowly fading into oblivion, replaced by a programmed echo that no longer truly belongs to me. Moving into a modest apartment on a quiet side street promised a fresh start after years of instability and restless wandering. I arrived on an overcast afternoon with a few boxes and an eagerness to begin anew. The building, an aging structure with narrow hallways and faded wallpaper, exuded a sense of history, and the polite nods of my few neighbors suggested a community steeped in routine. For the first several days, life was pleasantly mundane. Morning walks, grocery trips, and the distant hum of city life provided a comforting backdrop to my new existence. Yet, beneath the surface of ordinary life, subtle anomalies began to emerge. It started with a soft, rhythmic tapping in the dead of night, echoing faintly through the walls. At first, I dismissed it as the natural settling of an old building or perhaps the scurry of a small animal behind the plaster. But as nights passed, the tapping became increasingly deliberate, its cadence unerringly precise. Driven by curiosity and a need for logical explanation, I set up a digital recorder in my living room, hoping to capture the sound and analyze it. When I reviewed the recording the following morning, the eerie tapping was conspicuously absent, leaving only an unsettling silence that deepened my unease. Refusing to succumb to what I hoped was merely an overactive imagination, I delved into the building's history. I spent hours at the local library, poring over newspaper archives and speaking with long-term residents. I learned that the apartment complex had been built in the early 1900s on land once owned by a family shrouded in mystery and whispered rumors of occult practices. Though many dismissed these tales as superstitious folklore, a chill crept over me as I considered that the tapping might be tied to secrets buried deep within the building's past. As weeks turned into a month, the disturbances escalated in both intensity and variety. Objects in my apartment began to shift positions inexplicably. Photographs were found rotated on walls, and digital clocks would reset to times I did not recall setting. On one particularly stormy night, as rain lashed against my window and the wind whispered through the cracks of the old structure, I glimpsed a shadowy figure standing motionless in the corner of my room. The figure vanished the moment I turned my head, leaving only a lingering sense of dread and that persistent tapping echoing in my mind. Desperate for validation, I documented every unusual occurrence in a worn leather journal. I uploaded recordings and photos to an online forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena, seeking reassurance or perhaps an explanation from others who had experienced similar events. The responses were uniformly skeptical. Explanations ranged from faulty electronics to the psychological effects of isolation. A local paranormal investigator even visited, his instruments registering anomalous readings that defied conventional logic. "There's something here," he murmured, his voice heavy with uncertainty, "but I can't quite put my finger on it." His cryptic words only deepened the mystery. Late one night, when the building was cloaked in darkness and the only sound was the relentless beating of rain, I ventured into the basement, a place long avoided due to its oppressive air and whispered legends of unexplained happenings. In a narrow, dimly lit corridor, I discovered a door I'd never seen before. Its surface was adorned with intricate, shifting symbols that seemed to pulse in the faint light. Placing my ear against the cool wood, I heard not only the familiar tapping, but also a soft, almost inaudible whisper that appeared to call my name. Terrified yet compelled to understand, I hesitated, my rational mind warring with a primal urge to flee. Now, as I sit in the quiet of my apartment, the unanswered questions continue to haunt me. I have amassed a collection of recordings, photographs, and journal entries, yet each piece of evidence only deepens the enigma. Is the tapping merely a quirk of an old building, or does it herald a presence from a long-forgotten past? Could the shifting objects and fleeting shadows be manifestations of something supernatural? Or are they tricks played by a mind pushed to its limits? Despite my tireless search for a logical explanation, the mystery remains unsolved, leaving me to wonder whether I have inadvertently opened a door to forces beyond comprehension. I continue to lie awake at night, listening for that soft, relentless tapping, each echo carrying with it a question that may never be answered. Even now, I find myself questioning every rational explanation I once trusted. The building's history, the cryptic symbols on that mysterious door, and the inexplicable phenomena that plague my nights all suggest a reality that lies far beyond ordinary comprehension. I have attempted to secure expert opinions, consulted skeptics and believers alike, yet every inquiry leads only to more questions. The unease that has settled over me is both paralyzing and inescapable, a constant reminder that the boundary between our world and the unknown is perilously thin. I wonder if others in different places and at different times have experienced similar disturbances without ever understanding their true cause. Perhaps, somewhere out there, the same elusive tapping echoes in another forgotten corridor, carried by the wind of time and mystery. And so I record these words with trembling hands, uncertain if they will serve as a warning to others or simply as a chronicle of my descent into a mystery that defies reason. Each day, as I glance at the mirror or step into the hallway, I feel the persistent weight of unseen eyes and the echo of ancient secrets. I have come to understand that the search for truth can sometimes lead us into darkness from which there is no return. My only solace is the hope that in sharing my experience, I might one day find another soul brave enough to confront the unknown, and together we may finally unravel the enigma that haunts this place. Until that day arrives, I remain a prisoner of uncertainty, forever listening for the next tap, the next whisper, the next reminder that reality is not always as it seems. It started as a perfectly ordinary day. I left my apartment at the usual time, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, and stepped out into the city, confident in the familiarity of my routine. Yet as I walked down the sidewalk, I couldn't help but notice a sleek black sedan parked at the same corner for the third time that morning. I distinctly remembered it wasn't there when I passed by an hour ago, yet now it seemed to reappear as if by magic. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or perhaps I was simply tired. But deep inside, a subtle unease began to bubble. At work, everything felt normal. I greeted my colleagues, attended meetings, and typed away at my computer. Yet even in the humdrum of office life, small details began to nag at me. In the break room, I reached for the mug I'd left on the table the previous evening, only to find it exactly where I remembered it. But then a few hours later, I glanced at that very same spot and saw the mug again, untouched, even though I was sure I'd moved it to the sink for washing. I asked myself if I was losing track of time or if the mug had somehow never left its place. The answer eluded me, and the thought was unsettling. After work, I decided to take a detour on my way home, hoping that a change of scenery would shake off the disquiet. I walked down a side street lined with old brick buildings and familiar storefronts, yet something was off. A poster on a lamppost bore a date that I was sure was in the past, a flyer for an event that had long since ended. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the window of a closed shop. The person wore a dark jacket and a hat pulled low over their eyes. I felt a flash of recognition, as if I'd seen that exact person before, yet every time I tried to focus on their features, the memory slipped away. The street seemed to loop in on itself. The same corner, the same muted light, the same person waiting silently. That evening, back in my apartment, I began to notice more anomalies. I had always kept a small digital clock on my nightstand, its display clear and unchanging. But tonight, I swore the numbers flickered oddly, as if skipping seconds before resuming their usual count. I glanced around the room. Nothing else appeared out of place. The books on the shelf were in their proper order. The picture frames hung as they always had. Yet a persistent feeling of repetition gnawed at me. I walked to the window and looked out at the city below, noticing that the same car, that black sedan cruised by the street for a second time. It was as if time were recycling itself, offering me a looped playback of moments that should have been unique. Days turned into a series of these inexplicable glitches. I started keeping a meticulous journal, jotting down every odd detail. The repeated appearance of that sedan, the unchanging position of my favorite mug, the stray conversations that seemed to echo earlier dialogues. I'd ask friends if they'd noticed anything unusual, but their responses were always the same. Everything's normal, or maybe you're just overthinking it. Yet the evidence was right in front of me, small, undeniable inconsistencies that no one else acknowledged. One afternoon, I was sitting in a cafe when I overheard a snippet of conversation that made my heart skip a beat. A patron was describing a day exactly like mine. Returning home to find the same book left open on the coffee table, the same radio station playing a familiar tune that suddenly repeated. The description was so precise, so unnervingly similar to my own experiences, that I began to wonder if I was not alone in noticing the fractures in reality. But when I mentioned it to the barista, a person I had trusted for years, she only smiled and said, "Every day is the same, isn't it?" As if her words were part of some pre-written script. That night, as I lay in bed with the ceiling above me dark and silent, I experienced the most disconcerting moment yet. I awoke suddenly, certain that I had drifted off into a dream, only to realize that nothing had changed at all. The room was exactly as it had been when I went to sleep, the lamp still on, the clock still ticking. But then I noticed something impossible, the reflection in my bedroom mirror. For a split second, behind my own face, I saw another version of myself, a slight smirk playing at the corners of my lips, eyes filled with a knowing glint. I blinked, and the reflection returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. Yet that lingering image, that ghost of an alternate self, left me questioning whether my own reality was being subtly edited without my consent. As the weeks wore on, the glitches began to feel less like random coincidences and more like deliberate alterations in a grand, unseen system. I started noticing patterns. The same song played in unexpected places. The same stranger appeared repeatedly with minor variations. And the details of my day sometimes rewound themselves like a looped tape. It was as if I were living inside a program where the code was breaking down, where reality was no longer fluid but fixed to an endless cycle of repeated moments. I wasn't merely observing these events. I felt I was being absorbed into them, becoming a cog in a machine that governed time and space in ways I could not comprehend. One cold, overcast morning, while walking to work, I came to a sudden halt at an intersection. There, parked at the same spot for what seemed like the 100th time, was that familiar black sedan. I got out of my car and approached it slowly, as if drawn by some invisible force. When I reached the side, the door creaked open just a fraction, and I caught a glimpse of a face, my face. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. Every day, every small detail, was repeating not just around me, but within me. The boundaries between my own memory and the fabric of the world were dissolving. I felt trapped in an endless loop, a never-ending replay of moments that defied logical explanation. Now, as I write this, I sit alone in what once was my comfortable apartment, a place that now feels alien and contrived, as if every object and every shadow has been programmed into existence. I can no longer tell where I end and the glitch begins. The world around me is full of repetitions, inconsistencies, and subtle cues that hint at a reality designed to keep me locked in place. I've come to confront the possibility that the life I once knew was nothing more than a facade, a carefully constructed simulation from which there is no escape. And as I stare at the unchanging mug on the table, I can't help but wonder, does it even matter if the world is real, or if I become a permanent part of this glitch? The lines have blurred, and I fear that whatever truth lies beneath, I may have already been absorbed into the system, destined to repeat the same moments for eternity. I first noticed him on a drizzly Tuesday morning while I was seated at my favorite corner table in a little cafe near my office. I was lost in thought over my steaming cup of coffee when I saw a man casually step through the door. He wore a nondescript dark coat and a simple baseball cap that shadowed his eyes. At that moment, he seemed completely ordinary, a quiet customer like any other. I returned to my book, dismissing the brief flicker of unease as nothing more than a passing thought. A few days later, I was waiting at a bus stop on my way to work when I spotted him again. Standing a few feet away, he stared directly ahead, his posture unnervingly still. As the bus approached, our eyes met for an instant. There was a strange glimmer in his gaze, almost as if he were silently acknowledging something I couldn't quite place. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or perhaps I was reading too much into a random encounter. Still, that fleeting moment planted a seed of discomfort in my mind. Over the next several weeks, the occurrences multiplied. One evening while jogging in the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. I glanced to my right, and there he was, seated on a weathered bench beneath a flickering street lamp, his eyes fixed intently on the path I had just run. I quickened my pace and convinced myself that it was mere chance, a quirk of my imagination fueled by fatigue. But deep down, the notion that I was being observed began to take root. Then came the subtle signs that something was off. At the grocery store, I reached for a box of cereal only to feel a prickle on the back of my neck, as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move. I turned and, in the reflective surface of a freezer door, saw his unmistakable silhouette behind me for just a second. At first, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light or a stray reflection. Yet, over time, his appearances became more deliberate. I started to notice him lingering in places I frequented, the park, the bus stop, even the cramped corridors of my office building, always at moments when I least expected him. My anxiety escalated when I began to receive cryptic messages. One evening, I found a note slipped under my apartment door that simply read, "I know where you are." My heart raced, and I wondered if someone had taken a perverse interest in my routine. I mentioned it to a close friend, who suggested I was overreacting, that it might be a cruel prank or an error in judgment on my part. But the message lingered like a dark cloud over my thoughts, intensifying my paranoia. Each encounter chipped away at my sense of safety. I began to adjust my daily habits, taking longer routes, avoiding certain areas after dark, even switching to my regular coffee spot. Yet, no matter how much I tried to evade him, there he was, on one particularly dismal evening. As I hurried home under a shared umbrella with a coworker, I caught a glimpse of him standing across the street in the downpour. His eyes met mine, and his expression was unreadable, almost as if he were silently studying me. That moment sent a chill through my entire body. I felt as if he were not only watching, but waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the shadows. At work, the feeling of being hunted seeped into every conversation and every glance over my shoulder. I started to document these encounters in a worn notebook, jotting down the time, location, and my rapidly shifting emotions. The more I recorded, the more it seemed that his appearances were not random, but carefully timed, as if he were following a script that only he understood. Even mundane interactions took on an eerie quality. A friendly nod from a passerby suddenly felt like a signal, a silent message that I was part of someone's plan. Sleep became a fleeting memory. Each night, I found myself awake in the dark, eyes fixed on the window, expecting to see that persistent figure lurking outside. The pervasive sense of being watched morphed into a stifling dread that I couldn't escape. I felt trapped in a reality where every shadow, every unexpected sound, whispered the possibility that I was being deliberately sought out. I tried to confront the situation, even considered talking to him directly. But every time I mustered the courage, he was gone, replaced by a void of uncertainty and an unsettling calm that belied the storm raging within me. I began questioning my own perceptions. Was I truly being followed, or was my mind concocting a narrative fueled by loneliness and fear? The idea that I might be overreacting warred with the undeniable evidence of his constant presence, and the conflict left me paralyzed with indecision. Now, as I sit alone in my dimly lit apartment, I can't shake the dread that tomorrow might bring yet another inexplicable sighting. Every time I glance out the window, I braced myself for that familiar silhouette, silently haunting the periphery of my life. The unsettling question persists, gnawing at me with every heartbeat. Is this all a series of cruel coincidences born from an overactive imagination? Or is someone truly stalking me, orchestrating these encounters with a chilling precision? The uncertainty is suffocating, leaving me trapped between the realms of paranoia and reality. And so, with each passing day, I remain haunted by the possibility that I am not merely imagining it, that somewhere out there, a stranger watches, waiting for the next moment to step out of the shadows. I moved into my new apartment on a chilly November evening, excited for a fresh start. The building was old but charming, with hardwood floors, high ceilings, and a view of a quiet street lined with sycamore trees. For the first few days, everything felt perfectly ordinary, a modest life with routine pleasures. But then little things began to change. At first, it was subtle. I'd leave a book on the coffee table one night, only to find it later that morning lying on the sideboard, as if gently nudged during the night. I brushed it off as my own absent-mindedness, convinced I must have moved it in a half-asleep haze. The next oddity occurred when I returned from work to discover that the picture frame above my mantel, which I remembered hanging slightly off-center, was now perfectly aligned with the wall. It was such a small detail that I wondered if I was simply imagining it. As the days turned into weeks, the changes grew more frequent. I began noticing that objects I was sure I'd left exactly where I remembered would sometimes appear in different spots. My favorite mug, once resting on the kitchen counter, would be found in the sink the next day, as though someone had carefully placed it there. The doorknob on my bedroom door, which I always assumed was firmly attached, seemed to have a little extra give when I turned it one morning, a minute shift that sent a ripple of unease through me. The strangest part, however, was the way people around me started to act. At first, I thought it was my own overactive imagination. I'd catch my neighbor, Mrs. Dunham, who I'd known for years as a kind and chatty old lady, uttering a few words in a tone that sounded almost mechanical. When I mentioned it later, she only laughed and said, "I'm just a bit tired these days, dear." But her eyes never met mine the way they used to. They seemed distant, as if she were reciting a memorized script. My coworker, Kevin, who always cracked jokes and smiled readily, began giving answers that were too perfect, too rehearsed when I asked about our weekend plans. He'd sometimes pause as if searching for the right words, and then reply in a voice that didn't match the warmth I remembered. I started keeping a journal, hoping that writing down these anomalies would help me keep track of them, and perhaps find some logical explanation. But even my entries seemed to betray me. One day, I wrote about the precise arrangement of my living room after I'd returned from a late shift, only to find the same words in my notebook the next morning unchanged, as if my recollection of that evening had been overwritten. I began to question my own memory. Was it possible that everything was indeed the same, and I was simply being overly cautious? Yet deep down, a gnawing certainty told me that something was wrong. One night, I sat in my living room, staring at the clock as it ticked by, when I noticed a reflection in the window that didn't belong. Behind me, the familiar silhouette of my couch appeared, but then the outline of a person emerged next to it, a shape that looked like someone I recognized, yet whose face I couldn't quite place. I spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. When I tried to bring it up with my best friend over the phone, he dismissed it as a trick of the light and too much stress. But I knew what I'd seen. As the anomalies escalated, so did the feeling that my world was slowly unraveling. I started seeing the same car parked on my street multiple times in one day, even though I distinctly remembered it leaving early in the morning. The route I took to work, which I had driven countless times, suddenly seemed to morph. Familiar landmarks were there, yet they were slightly altered, as if the city itself had been subtly redesigned overnight. I began to see the same stranger on different occasions. A man in a gray coat who'd be standing at a bus stop one moment and then appear in a cafe the next, his expression blank and knowing, as if he were aware of the changes that no one else could see. I attempted to talk to others about these shifts, but they all insisted nothing was out of the ordinary. My co-workers laughed off my concerns as mere overthinking, and even my neighbor Mrs. Dunham assured me she was just imagining things. Every time I brought it up, their reactions only deepened my isolation. It was as if I were the only one with eyes wide open to the slowly morphing world around me, while everyone else walked in a state of blissful ignorance. One rainy evening, as I lay in bed with the sound of raindrops tapping the window, I felt an overwhelming compulsion to check my apartment. I crept out of bed and made my way to the living room in a half-daze, only to freeze in terror. The layout of the room had shifted. The coffee table, which I remembered being placed at the center, was now pushed against the wall. My couch, once neatly arranged, had its cushions mismatched and oddly positioned. I ran my fingers along the bookshelf, feeling the smooth surface of books that I was sure I just rearranged in perfect order. A sense of dread overwhelmed me. I realized that I was no longer in the home I thought I had created. I stood there, trembling, trying to rationalize the inexplicable. Was it possible that I was losing my grip on reality? But the changes were too concrete, too vivid. I moved from room to room, desperately searching for the familiarity that used to comfort me, only to be met with subtle distortions at every turn. The walls seemed to breathe. The patterns on the curtains shifted in the dim light, and every sound was a reminder that something was off. Now, as I write this in the dead of night, I feel trapped in a world that looks normal to everyone else, but is anything but normal to me. I wonder if I'm the only one who perceives these changes, if somehow I have become attuned to a hidden reality that others have shut out. Every time I try to explain, every time I ask for validation, I am met with denial or indifference. And that is the most frightening part, the realization that my perception, however unsettling, might be the only truth left in a world that is silently slipping into a new, alien order. I am left with a lingering question. Is this all in my head, or is the world around me truly shifting into something unrecognizable and hostile? I fear that the day may come when these subtle glitches will escalate into something I can no longer live with, a reality where my memories and surroundings are so altered that I will no longer know who I am or where I belong. For now, I live in quiet terror, isolated by a truth that no one else seems to share, in a world that feels increasingly like a prison of shifting illusions. It started with something so small that I almost forgot about it. I had just moved into a new apartment, a decent one-bedroom in an older building, the kind with creaky floors and outdated fixtures. The rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed nice, though oddly eager for me to move in. No one's lived in this unit for a while, he had mentioned casually when I signed the lease. I didn't think much of it at the time. The first strange thing happened about a week after I moved in. I came home from work one evening and noticed my bathroom light was on. I was sure I had turned it off before leaving. I stood there for a moment, my keys still in my hand, stomach tightening. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I'd been in too much of a rush that morning. I convinced myself it was nothing and brushed it off. Then, a few days later, I woke up to find my front door unlocked. I distinctly remember locking it the night before. I always check, always double check. Yet there was unlocked. A small seed of unease settled in my stomach. Was I getting careless? I started taking extra precautions, making sure to lock the door, testing it multiple times before going to bed. Then I met my neighbor, or rather, he introduced himself. One evening, as I was coming back from the grocery store, a man in his late 40s stepped out of the apartment next to mine. He had thinning hair, tired eyes, and a forced kind of smile. "Hey there," he said. "I'm Greg. You just moved in, right?" I nodded. "Yeah, about 2 weeks ago." He glanced at my groceries and gave a small chuckle. "Stocking up, huh? That's good. You never know when you'll need to stay inside for a while." The way he said it made my skin crawl. There was something strange about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I gave a polite smile and made an excuse to go inside. As I shut the door, I could feel his eyes lingering on me just a little too long. After that, things started to get weirder. I began hearing noises at night, soft creaking sounds like footsteps moving just outside my apartment. I told myself it was just the old building settling, but some nights, it almost sounded like breathing. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow. One morning, as I was heading out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My doormat was slightly off-center. I always lined it up perfectly, and yet it was crooked, like someone had moved it. I crouched down and lifted it. There, underneath, was a small piece of folded paper. My hands trembled as I opened it. "You're not supposed to be here." I stood up so fast I nearly lost my balance. My heart pounded. I looked around the empty hallway, half expecting someone to be watching. But there was no one, just the flickering overhead light and the hum of the old building. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That someone left a note under my doormat? That my door was unlocked once? It wasn't enough. The next day, I went to my landlord. I told him about the note, about the unlocked door. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and then simply said, "Maybe you should find another place." I blinked. "What?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, this unit, some people don't do well here. Maybe it's not for you." "Do well here?" I repeated. "What does that even mean?" He shook his head. "Nothing. Just keep your doors locked." I left his office feeling even worse than before. What wasn't he telling me? That night, I wedged a chair under my doorknob before going to bed. I wasn't taking any chances. Then came the worst night. I woke up to a noise. A soft, deliberate scraping sound, like metal against wood. My entire body went rigid. It was coming from my front door. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking, and checked the time. 3:14 nachts. The scraping continued, slow and methodical. I forced myself out of bed, gripping the knife from under my pillow. The scraping stopped. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, right outside my door. "Why are you still here?" I nearly dropped the knife. My vision blurred with panic. My body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. The doorknob jiggled. Someone was trying to get in. I snapped out of it, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. The operator answered, but before I could speak, something changed. The air in my apartment felt different, like the pressure had shifted. The whispering stopped. I listened. Nothing. The doorknob was still. The scraping was gone. I hesitated, then moved to the peephole. My breath hitched. There was no one there. The hallway was empty. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I packed a bag and left. I didn't care about my lease, my deposit, any of it. I just wanted out. I stayed with a friend across town while I searched for a new place. I never went back to that apartment alone. A week later, my friend and I drove back to grab the last of my things. As we walked up to the building, we saw Greg standing outside. He was just standing there, staring at my old window. When he saw me, his face twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Leaving already?" he asked, tilting his head. I didn't answer. I just grabbed my things as fast as I could and got out. That was the last time I ever saw him. A few months later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched for any news related to that building. What I found made my stomach drop. There had been 3 other tenants before me in that same unit. All of them had moved out abruptly, just like I did. One of them had filed a police report. The report mentioned noises at night, doors being unlocked, and a neighbor named Greg. No arrests were ever made. I don't know what was happening in that apartment, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that whisper outside my door. Why are you still here? And I wonder, who or what was really asking the question? I first noticed something odd on an otherwise ordinary Thursday. I was on my usual walk to the coffee shop when I spotted a man standing by the bus stop. At first glance, he looked like any other commuter, tall, with a thin coat and a low cap pulled over his eyes. But there was an indescribable quality about him, a stillness in his gaze that made me pause. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen him before, even though I was sure I'd never met him. I waved a half-hearted hello as I passed, and for a split second, his lips curled into what I can only describe as a knowing smile. The moment passed, and I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. After all, people can look familiar without being someone you know. That day, everything felt just slightly off. When I reached the coffee shop, the barista's friendly greeting seemed rehearsed, too mechanical, as if she had been waiting for my arrival rather than genuinely welcoming me. I ordered my usual, a black coffee with a hint of cinnamon, and sat by the window. As I sipped, I caught a glimpse of the same man across the street, leaning against a lamppost. His posture was unnaturally still, and though I couldn't see his face clearly in the passing twilight, something about his presence unsettled me. I assumed it was a coincidence, a mere trick of fate that our paths would cross twice in one day. I tried to dismiss it, but a subtle undercurrent of dread began to build in my chest. The following day, I woke up with a lingering sense of déjà vu. I went about my routine, yet small details refused to align with my memories. My alarm clock, which I distinctly remembered setting for 6:30 a.m., now read 6:45. I recalled leaving my apartment at a certain pace, only to feel as if I had hurried through the door more quickly than usual. While commuting, I noticed the same delivery truck idling at the same red light that I'd passed the day before, even though I was convinced that I hadn't seen it then. And every time I reached for my phone to check the time, the numbers seemed to flicker momentarily, as though the very fabric of time were glitching. As the days went on, these anomalies grew bolder. At work, I found that conversations with colleagues would sometimes loop back on themselves. I distinctly remembered a discussion about an upcoming project, only to have a coworker later remark on details that I was certain we had covered already. During lunch breaks, I caught myself staring at a familiar face in the crowd, a face I recognized from that first encounter by the bus stop. When I approached to say hello, the person before me looked different. The same build and height, yet his features had shifted subtly, his eyes now a piercing blue instead of the dark, unreadable depths I recalled. He smiled, and in that smile was an unsettling mix of familiarity and alienness. "We meet again," he said softly, as though it were a casual greeting rather than a moment of significance. At home, the glitches did not relent. I began noticing that objects in my apartment were not quite where I remembered leaving them. The books on my shelf were arranged in a slightly different order, and my favorite mug, once sitting on the side table, was now in the kitchen cupboard. I would step into a room and feel as if I had already been there, a vague recollection of a conversation or a piece of music drifting through my mind, only to find that nothing was as I remembered. One evening, I sat down to watch a film I'd seen countless times. Halfway through, the scene repeated, as if I had rewound the movie without my consent. I paused the remote in disbelief, and the screen stuttered before resuming the film as though nothing had happened. It wasn't just the physical environment that betrayed me. My own memories began to fracture. I found notes scribbled in my handwriting on scrap paper that I was sure I hadn't written. Sometimes, I would recall a conversation with a friend only to have them insist that I'd said something entirely different. I started to document every incident in a worn notebook, desperate to catch a pattern, to prove to myself that these were not just figments of an overactive mind. But the more I wrote, the more I realized that even my documentation was inconsistent. Dates and times would shift, and entries would appear to contradict one another, as if my recollection of reality was being edited in real time. One particularly disquieting afternoon, I was driving home when I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw, for a fleeting moment, the same man from the bus stop sitting in the back seat. I whipped around, heart pounding, only to find the seat empty. The streetlights blurred into long streaks of neon as I sped away, my mind racing with the possibility that I was losing my grip on reality. I began to wonder if I was the one experiencing a glitch, if somehow I had become part of a larger anomaly that was rewriting not just my day, but my very existence. Every encounter with that enigmatic stranger left me more unsettled. Each time he appeared, his look would change imperceptibly, a different hat, a shift in his smile, a glint in his eyes that spoke of secrets too vast to comprehend. Sometimes he would appear in reflective surfaces, a shop window, a puddle on the sidewalk, or even the screen of a paused video game. And every time, he was there, silently observing, as though he were both the cause and the product of these distortions in time and space. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my apartment, I can no longer distinguish between what I remember and what is happening right now. The familiar world I once knew has fractured into a series of looping moments and altered memories. I have come to realize with a sinking certainty that I am entangled in this glitch, that reality is no longer fixed but fluid, a collage of repeated scenes and shifting details that I cannot control. I find myself wondering if every decision I make is already predetermined by some hidden code, if every encounter is but a glitch in a system that refuses to remain stable. In the quiet moments of the night, when the hum of the city is replaced by an eerie silence, I question whether I have become part of a simulation, a fragment in a corrupted file where time loops endlessly and faces change at the blink of an eye. I don't know if I'll ever be able to return to the normalcy of yesterday, if the reality I once trusted is nothing more than an illusion now. The line between what's real and what's a glitch is blurred, and I fear I may never escape this relentless cycle. Every day, every moment, I am left with the haunting thought that I am trapped in a loop of anomalies, a living echo in a world that is slowly breaking down, and that I have become inseparable from the glitch itself.